In the climate-controlled vault of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, beneath layers of modern security and archival silence, sits an object that some scholars call the most unsettling document in human possession, not because of what it depicts, war, conquest, divine wrath, but because of what it records, with bureaucratic precision, the impossible. The World Blundell Prism, catalogue number WB444, stands 20 centimetres tall. Baked clay, inscribed around 1800 BC, its four sides contain 368 lines of cuneiform script. The text is neither poetry nor prayer, it reads like a government archive, a king list, names, cities, reign lengths, the kind of administrative record found in tax offices and census bureaus, except for one detail that separates this document from every other historical registry ever compiled. Before the Great Flood, it claims, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaulgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. And Menluana of Bad Tibera, 43,200 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years of continuous governance. Then the flood swept over the earth, and after the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven a second time. You are here because the title of this investigation made a specific promise that Sumerian texts reveal alien influence on the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. Not metaphor, not mythology interpreted through modern wishful thinking, but texts that, when read plainly, describe something the Sumerians themselves did not consider metaphorical at all: the presence and intervention of beings they called the Anunnaki, who came from the sky, who established civilization, who debated humanity's fate in councils, and who, eventually, withdrew, leaving collapse in their wake. If you're listening in the quiet hours, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment about your location and what time it is where you're drifting. The questions we're examining tonight are old, but the willingness to examine them without prejudgment is rare. Let's see how far this community reaches. The approach here will be different from what you may have encountered. There will be no claims of proof, no declarations of certainty. What follows is an examination of what these tablets actually say in their own procedural, administrative language, and an exploration of why those statements remain deeply uncomfortable for both mainstream archaeology and alternative theorists alike. Because the texts don't fit cleanly into either framework. They resist both dismissal as pure myth and easy adoption as ancient astronaut confirmation. They simply state and wait. The World Blundell Prism is not alone. It represents one thread in a vast textile of tablets, excavated from Mesopotamian sands over the last century and a half, housed now in museums across Philadelphia, London, Oxford, Istanbul, Paris. Tens of thousands of documents, the oldest known writing, and threaded through them, described with the same linguistic tone used for barley rations and property boundaries, are accounts of beings from elsewhere who shaped human destiny at crucial junctures, beings with names, ranks, jurisdictions, beings who made decisions about humanity the way administrators make decisions about infrastructure. The question is not whether the Sumerians wrote these things. The clay is real, the script is real, the translations are verified. The question is what those writings represent. 3 possibilities emerge: pure mythology serving symbolic purposes, encoded wisdom teachings in narrative form, or documentary records of actual events involving non-human intelligences. Academic consensus holds firmly to the first. Popular alternative theories leap to the third, but the texts themselves occupy an uncomfortable space that doesn't satisfy either interpretation completely. This investigation will walk through that uncomfortable space, slowly, with attention to what the tablets actually say, who translated them, where they were found, and what patterns emerge when multiple independent sources are placed alongside one another. There will be sections where mainstream scholarly interpretations are presented because they deserve fair hearing. There will be sections where those interpretations struggle to account for specific textual details, and there will be long stretches where the evidence is simply presented, allowing you to weigh it. Because if the Sumerians preserve something true, if their accounts contain even a thread of documented memory about external intervention in human civilization, then the implications reshape everything we understand about our origins, our trajectory, and perhaps our future. And if they don't, if these are purely symbolic narratives, then we must ask why this particular civilization chose such precise procedural language to encode their symbolism when other cultures used poetry and metaphor. The Weld Blundell prism sits in its vault. The reign lengths have not changed in 4,000 years. The names remain. The flood is documented, and the phrase appears twice: kingship descended from heaven, once before the waters, once after, as if civilization were not invented, but installed, then reinstalled. Let's begin where writing begins. The language of gods made flesh. The Sumerian language was dead for 2,000 years before modern scholars heard its voice again. Not metaphorically dead, actually extinct, replaced by Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, then buried under Persian, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, until the mounds of southern Iraq held only silence and the rumours of Babel. When European archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the mid-19th century, they found thousands of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that no living person could read. The script was called cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, but wedges of what meaning no one could say. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, not from temple archives or royal libraries, but from a cliff face in western Iran, where 3 languages proclaimed the same message in parallel columns. The Behistun inscription, carved at the command of Persian King Darius I around 520 BCE, presented Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian versions of the same royal decree. British officer Henry Rawlinson risked his life copying the inscription from precarious scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground. By 1846, using the Old Persian as a key, a language partially understood through its relationship to Sanskrit, scholars began unlocking Babylonian cuneiform. But Babylonian was Semitic, related to Hebrew and Arabic. Beneath it lay something stranger. Tablets from southern Iraq contained an older language, non-Semitic, unrelated to any known linguistic family. Sumerian, the language of the first cities. By the 1850s, scholars began recovering its grammar, its vocabulary, its very different way of structuring reality into words. And as they did, as translations accumulated, a peculiar pattern emerged that troubled the translators themselves. Cuneiform tablets came in varieties. There were literary epics with poetic language, mythological drama, emotional dialogue. There were prayers and hymns with religious fervour and metaphorical richness. There were wisdom texts offering moral instruction in proverbial form. And then there were the administrative tablets, thousands upon thousands of them. Records of barley shipments, labour assignments, land transfers, tax receipts, bureaucratic archives written in the plain, precise language of accountants and census takers. Subject, verb, object, dates, quantities, locations, the driest prose imaginable. The unsettling discovery was that texts describing the Anunnaki and their interactions with humanity were often written in this second register, not the language of myth, but the language of record keeping. Consider the opening of the Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eredug. In Eredug, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. This is not poetic. It does not say in the time before time, or when the gods walked among men, or employ any of the formulaic openings found in mythology worldwide. It states an administrative fact: kingship descended, it was located in Eridu, a named individual held the office, duration of reign noted. Next entry. The same tone appears in creation accounts. The Barton cylinder, excavated from Nippur and housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum as CBS 8383, describes the establishment of early cities and the organisation of divine responsibilities in language that reads like a corporate restructuring memo. Territories are assigned, roles are distributed, functions are allocated. Anu takes the sky, Enlil takes the earth, Enki takes the waters. Not because of dramatic conflict or cosmic battles, but as though according to some prior agreement or systematic division of labour. French Assyriologist Jean Botreau spent decades studying Mesopotamian thought and noted this peculiarity in his work Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning, and the Gods. He observed that the Mesopotamians approached their deities with what he called positive reasoning, a pragmatic, almost scientific mindset that treated divine beings as real entities with discernible patterns of behaviour, territorial jurisdictions, and political relationships. They recorded interactions with gods the way they recorded interactions with neighbouring kings. Same linguistic register, same evidentiary assumptions. This matters because when we encounter texts describing the Anunnaki, the group name for these sky-descended beings, we must recognise that we're not reading Homeric epic or Norse saga. The Iliad opens, "Sing, O goddess," the anger of Achilles. The Epic of Gilgamesh opens, "He who saw the deep," the country's foundation. Poetic invocations, metaphorical framing, but the king list simply begins, "After the kingship descended from heaven," as if this were a known historical event, the mechanism of which required no elaboration because the audience understood it as readily as they understood trade caravans or irrigation systems. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur between 1888 and 1900 recovered over 30,000 tablets, the largest collection of Sumerian literary and administrative texts ever found at a single site. Catalogued under the CBS log of the Babylonian section numbering system, these tablets now allow scholars to cross-reference multiple copies of the same texts, noting variations and consistencies across centuries. What emerges is striking. The accounts of Anunnaki involvement in human affairs remain consistent in their procedural tone across multiple independent sources, spanning hundreds of years of copying and transmission. Consider how knowledge of these beings was transmitted. Sumerian was already a dead language by 2000 BC, yet Babylonian and Assyrian scribes continued copying Sumerian texts for another 1500 years, creating the bilingual dictionaries and grammatical guides that eventually allowed modern scholars to decipher the language. Why preserve dead texts so meticulously? Because they were considered foundational, not entertaining stories, but essential records. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the 1850s, contained over 30,000 tablets, including Babylonian copies of Sumerian originals. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BC, commissioned scribes to collect and copy ancient texts from throughout Mesopotamia. His library catalogue note on one tablet reads, "Palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, who trusts in Ashur and Ninlil, to whom Nabu and Tashmatu have given wide understanding, who has acquired keen insight into the most recondite details of scholarly erudition, of which none of the kings, my forefathers, had any knowledge." This was not a collector of myths. This was a king seeking knowledge he believed was real, preserved in ancient texts that his predecessors had not understood. He was looking for something practical, applicable, true, and among the texts he preserved with greatest care were those describing the Anunnaki and their activities. Tablet K3375, housed in the British Museum, contains the flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet C of that epic, often called the Flood Tablet. It was excavated from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and represents one of the most complete versions of the flood account. When George Smith first translated it in 1872 and presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, the room erupted in controversy, not because it was mythology, but because it was history that preceded and paralleled the biblical flood narrative. Smith himself suffered a nervous breakdown from the implications and died during a subsequent expedition to find missing fragments. The text disturbed him not for its poetic beauty, but for its documentary precision. The linguistic register matters. When Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, recounts his experience to Gilgamesh, he describes receiving specific architectural instructions for the boat. The boat that thou shalt build, her dimensions shall be measured. Equal shall be her width and her length. Like the Apsu, thou shalt roof her over. These are not vague divine visions. These are blueprints, measurements, technical specification. The language is that of an engineer's manual. Compare this to how other ancient cultures described similar events. Greek mythology recounts Deucalion's flood in poetic, impressionistic terms. Hindu texts describe the Matsya avatar pulling Manu's boat in metaphorical language. Norse mythology frames Ymir's blood flood in cosmic symbolism. But the Mesopotamian accounts read like disaster preparedness documentation. Build this, seal it with this, bring these. When the signs appear, enter, close the door, wait. Oxford philologist Stephanie Dalley, in her translation work Myths from Mesopotamia, notes this peculiarity. The audience for whom these texts were written seems to have been expected to regard them as factual accounts, or at the very least, as preserving factual cause embellished with literary elaboration. The distinction between myth and history that modern readers assume was not clearly drawn in ancient Mesopotamia. This creates an interpretive problem. Modern scholarship approaches these texts with the assumption that anything involving gods or supernatural beings must be mythology by definition. But the ancient scribes who preserved these texts did not share that assumption. They placed accounts of Anunnaki activities alongside accounts of historical kings, used the same language, employed the same archival methods. For them, these were records of events that shaped their civilization's trajectory. The translators themselves have sometimes expressed discomfort with what they're translating. Samuel Noah Kramer, the pioneering Sumerologist who translated hundreds of tablets, wrote in History Begins at Sumer that the texts required the suspension of certain modern categories of thought to be understood on their own terms. He was cautioning against imposing our mythology versus history binary onto a culture that conceptualized reality differently. When Inanna descends to the underworld in tablet British Museum 69737, she passes through 7 gates, removes 1 article of regalia at each, and arrives naked before her sister Ereshkigal. The text specifies each gate, names the gatekeeper Nat, lists each removed item. This level of procedural detail suggests something beyond pure symbolism. Symbolic narratives typically don't require such specificity. Dante can guide us through 9 circles of hell with allegorical richness. He doesn't need to provide the actual gate measurements or the doorkeeper's employment records, but the Sumerian text does, as if someone might need to follow these directions, as if this were documentation of a real place with a real structure. The same pattern appears in descriptions of the Anunnaki themselves. They have names, not just archetypes. They have genealogies spanning generations. They have jurisdictions. Enki rules water and wisdom. Enlil governs air and earth. Anu holds primacy over heaven. They have cities where they maintain residences. Enki at Eridu, Enlil at Nippur, Inanna at Uruk, Nanna at Ur. These are not vague Mount Olympus somewhere over their arrangements. These are documented locations, excavated by archaeologists, where temple complexes stood that were identified as the earthly residences of specific Anunnaki. The Iabzu temple at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, dates to around 5400 BC in its earliest phases, making it one of the oldest known temple structures in the world. The texts describe it as Enki's earthly house, built over the Abzu, the freshwater abyss he governed. Excavations at Tel Abu Shirain in the 1940s revealed 17 successive temple rebuildings on the same spot, spanning thousands of years. Each generation rebuilt exactly where the previous temple stood, as though the location itself held significance independent of the structure. Why? According to the texts, because that's where Enki established his residence. That's where the connection to the Abzu existed. That's where you could find him. This leads to an uncomfortable question that has no comfortable answer. If these accounts are pure mythology, why the administrative precision? Why catalogue numbers, architectural specifications, genealogical records, jurisdictional boundaries? Mythology doesn't require such details, but documentation does, record keeping does, archives do. And if these are documentation, if they preserve even a core of factual memory about actual events, then the Sumerians were recording encounters with intelligences they called Anunnaki, who descended from the sky, who organised civilization, who made decisions about humanity's fate, and who eventually withdrew. The texts say this repeatedly, across multiple independent sources, in the same tone used to document barley harvests. The question cannot be whether the Sumerians wrote these things. The clay is undeniable. The question is what reality these writings reflect, and that question leads directly to the world before the waters came. Before the waters came. There is a pattern in human memory older than agriculture, more widespread than any empire. The memory of a world before this world. A world that ended in water. The Mesopotamian tablets don't merely contain this memory, they provide something rarer administrative documentation of what that earlier world contained. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is fragmentary but revelatory. Dating to approximately 1600 BC, but copied from older Sumerian sources, it describes the creation of humans, the establishment of cities before the flood, the appointment of kingship, and the divine decision to send the deluge. What makes this text remarkable is not its flood narrative, such narratives appear worldwide, but what it documents about the pre-flood civilization itself. The text states, after Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had fashioned the black-headed people, vegetation luxuriated from the earth, animals, four-legged creatures of the plain, were brought artfully into existence. Note the sequence: humans fashioned first, then environment established. This inverts the expected biological progression. The text continues, after the of kingship had been lowered from heaven, after the exalted crown and throne of kingship had been lowered from heaven, the divine rights and the exalted powers were perfected. Kingship lowered from heaven, not developed through social evolution, not gradually centralized from tribal structures, lowered from heaven as a complete system with divine rights and exalted powers already perfected. The language suggests installation of a governmental framework from an external source. The text then lists 5 cities that existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. Each city is associated with a specific deity who governed it. Each had a king whose reign length is documented, and then the critical phrase, the flood swept over, after which the text states, kingship was lowered from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. The Weld-Blundell prism corroborates this structure. Its antediluvian section lists 8 kings across 5 cities, reigning for a cumulative 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The repetition of lowered from heaven after the flood implies that whatever mechanism established kingship the first time had to re-establish it after the catastrophe. This is not mythological language, this is reset protocol. Who were these antediluvian kings? The names are preserved: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzid, Ensipaziana, Enmendurana, Ubartutu. Some of these names appear in other contexts. Dumuzid, later known as Tammuz, becomes a significant figure in later mythology. Enmendurana is believed by some scholars to be the Sumerian equivalent of the biblical Enoch, the seventh patriarch, who walked with God and did not die, but was taken. In Sumerian tradition, Enmendurana was taken to heaven by the sun god Utu and given knowledge of divination and priestcraft, which he brought back to humanity. Again, not evolution of religious practice, but installation of knowledge from above. The instructions of Shurpak, preserved on tablets from Abu Salabic dating to approximately 2600 BC, present themselves as the teachings of Shurpak, son of Ubartutu, the last antediluvian king, to his sons Yasudra, who would become the flood hero. This places the text's internal chronology at the very end of the pre-flood period. The instructions contain practical wisdom, my son. Do not speak arrogantly to your mother. Do not pass judgment when you drink beer. Do not travel during the night. Night can be ambushed with evil. This is not timeless mythological wisdom. This is situational advice for a functioning society with social structures, legal systems, nighttime dangers. One passage is particularly striking, my son. You should not locate a field on a road. The way is where men gather. This implies property law, agricultural practice, road systems, public versus private space, the infrastructure of organised civilization. Another passage advises, you should not buy a donkey that brays, it would cause you trouble, suggesting markets, commerce, animal husbandry, quality assessment. These are not the conditions of primitive humanity learning to farm. These are the concerns of an established civilization. The Atra-Hasis epic, known from multiple versions including tablets from the British Museum's collection, provides perhaps the most detailed account of pre-flood civilization and why it was destroyed. The text describes a situation where the Anunnaki had divided labour between two classes, the higher-ranking Anunnaki and the lower-ranking Igigi. The Igigi were tasked with hard labour, digging rivers, maintaining irrigation, construction work. After 3,600 years, the text is specific of this labour, the Igigi rebelled. They surrounded Enlil's temple at night, burned their tools, and refused to continue. In response to this labour crisis, Enki proposed creating humans to bear the work instead. The text describes the process. Let one god be slaughtered, and let the gods be cleansed by immersion. Let Nintu mix clay with his flesh and blood. Let God and man be mixed together in the clay. This is presented not as metaphor, but as a biotechnological solution to a labour shortage. Humans are designed for purpose, to work the fields, maintain the irrigation systems, provide food for the gods. The strategy succeeds. Humans multiply, they work, they build. Civilization develops. But then comes the problem that leads to the flood. 1,200 years had not yet passed when the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. This is not a moral judgment about human wickedness, as in the biblical flood narrative. This is a noise complaint. Humanity has become too numerous, too loud, too active. The expansion of human civilization has created what Enlil considers an intolerable disturbance. He decides on extermination. Here the text reveals a critical division among the Anunnaki. Enlil pushes for complete destruction. Enki, who designed humans in the first place, opposes this. He cannot openly defy Enlil's authority, but he finds a workaround. He warns Atra-Hasis, the Sumerian equivalent of the flood hero, through indirect means. He He doesn't speak to Atrahasis directly, but addresses a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis will overhear. Reed wall, 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 reed wall, here, wall, consider. Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, demolish the house, build a boat, reject possessions, and save life. This subterfuge suggests something important. The Anunnaki operated within rules, within hierarchies, within systems of authority they couldn't simply ignore. Enki doesn't stop the flood. He lacks that authority. He doesn't openly rebel. That's prohibited. He works within the constraints of his position to preserve a remnant of humanity against Enlil's edict. This is not how we expect gods to behave. Gods in mythology typically have unlimited agency within their domains, but the Anunnaki are described as operating within organizational constraints, political limitations, hierarchical structures. The pre-flood world, according to these texts, was not primitive. It had cities, kingship, administration, temples, agriculture, crafts, writing. The instructions of Shuruppak reference measuring, writing, and calculation. The Eridu mentions divine rights and exalted powers being perfected. The king list documents successive dynasties with administrative continuity. This was a functioning civilization, one that, according to the texts, did not gradually evolve, but was lowered from heaven as a complete system. Archaeological evidence provides an intriguing parallel. The emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3500–3000 BC is abrupt in ways that have troubled archaeologists for decades. The transition from the Ubaid period, characterized by small agricultural villages, to the Uruk period, characterized by large cities with monumental architecture, complex administration, and writing, happens within a few centuries, historically speaking, nearly instantaneous. Writing appears suddenly, already sophisticated. Cities appear suddenly, already organized. The potter's wheel, metallurgy, cylinder seals, monumental architecture, numerical systems, all appear in a relatively compressed time frame. Standard archaeological interpretation attributes this to rapid but natural development. But the texts themselves suggest a different sequence. Civilization installed, then disrupted by catastrophe, then reinstalled. The archaeological record shows the Uruk fluorescence, this sudden appearance of complex civilization, but it doesn't show the clear developmental stages leading to it. It's as though someone hit fast forward through the expected millennia of gradual complexification. The Sumerian texts provide a potential explanation. This wasn't the first time. This was restoration. The antediluvian civilization had already achieved these advancements. The flood destroyed it. The post-flood civilization was re-established using preserved knowledge under guidance from the same Anunnaki who had established it originally. Kingship lowered from heaven the second time. If this reading has any validity, if these texts preserve memory of an actual pre-flood civilization that achieved considerable sophistication under external guidance, then the standard narrative of linear human development requires revision. The texts describe not slow evolution from simplicity to complexity, but installation, catastrophe, reinstallation, a pattern of intervention. The question becomes, intervention by whom? The texts are explicit, the Anunnaki, and we must examine what the tablets say about these beings when they speak of them in plain script, without interpretive filters, in their own recorded words. The Anunnaki in plain script. The term Anunnaki appears hundreds of times across Mesopotamian texts spanning 2 millennia. In Sumerian, it's written Nuna, meaning princely offspring or offspring of Anu. In Akkadian versions, they're called Anunnaku. They're referenced not as mythological abstractions, but as specific individuals with documented roles, locations, and activities. To understand what the Sumerians recorded about external influence on civilization, we must examine what they said about these beings without modern filtering.
The Barton cylinder, CBS 8383, excavated at Nippur, and dating to the mid-3rd millennium BC, provides one of the earliest written accounts of the Anunnaki's role in cosmic organization. The text describes the separation of heaven and earth and the distribution of domains among the primary deities, after heaven had been moved away from earth, after earth had been separated from heaven, after the name of man had been fixed, after An had carried off heaven, after Enlil had carried off earth, Enki set sail for the Abzu. This describes a division of authority. Anu, Alamunlian, takes the heavens, Enlil takes the earth, Enki takes the Abzu, the freshwater depths beneath the earth. The language is territorial, jurisdictional. These are not symbolic domains of cosmic forces, but administrative zones with assigned governors. The text continues to describe how Enki organizes the Abzu, appoints lesser deities to specific functions, and establishes the basis for agricultural prosperity and human civilization. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on tablets from the Library of Ashurbanipal, including British Museum 9317, provides extensive detail on Anunnaki hierarchy and function. Though written in Akkadian during the late Babylonian period, it draws on older Sumerian tradition. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat representing primordial chaos, he reorganizes the cosmos and assigns positions to the Anunnaki, 300 in heaven, as a guard he posted. The ways of earth he measured, and he founded Ashara, similar to it. Ashara, which he made, the temple, he caused the Anunnaki's fathers to live in it. Note the numbers, 300 Anunnaki stationed in heaven, with a corresponding number on earth. These are not poetic multitudes, but specific counts. The text describes organizational structure. He opened the Ashara, the assembly place of the great gods. To the stars their courses he assigned. This is administrative language, assignment of stations, organization of function, delegation of responsibility. The term assembly appears repeatedly in reference to the Anunnaki. They convene assemblies to make decisions. These gatherings have formal structure. In the Atrahasis epic, when the Ajiji rebel against their labor, the text states, they called together an assembly. The great Anunnaki, who decree fates, were summoned. The council deliberates, hears arguments, and makes a decision, the creation of humans to replace Ajiji labor. This is parliamentary procedure, not mythological fiat. The flood decision follows similar process. Enlil proposes extermination. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. Let there be a plague. Let the lightning strike. Let the storm. Let the flood come and destroy mankind. But he doesn't simply decree it. He must convince the council. The Gilgamesh flood account Toblet Shi, British Museum K 3375, describes Utnapishtim recalling, the gods, the Anunnaki, sat together. Enlil came and sat in the assembly. Individual Anunnaki speak, argue, vote. After the flood, when surviving humans are discovered, the assembly reconvenes to address what this means and how to proceed. This procedural nature suggests something conventional mythology doesn't typically portray: limitations on authority. Enlil cannot unilaterally destroy humanity. He must work through the assembly. Enki cannot openly oppose the flood decision. He must find indirect means of resistance. The Anunnaki operate within systems, hierarchy, protocols. They have power, but constrained power. Authority, but divided authority. Individual Anunnaki have documented characteristics and specialization. Enki is repeatedly described as the wisest, the craftsman, the solver of problems. His epithet is Lord of the Earth, but his domain is water and wisdom. Temple hymns addressed to Enki at his Abzu temple in Eridu call him King of the Abzu, Great Master of Destinies, Shepherd of the Land, he who rules the rights of the land. These are administrative, not merely symbolic titles. Texts describe Enki possessing the Me, a Sumerian term without direct translation, referring to the divine decrees, powers, or principles that govern civilization. The Me are not abstract concepts, but concrete possessions that can be transferred, stolen, or given. One of the most revealing narratives concerns Inanna's acquisition of the Me from Enki. According to texts from Nippur, parts of the CBS collection, Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki. He welcomes her with a feast and plentiful beer. As Enki becomes intoxicated, Inanna asks him for the Me, and he gives them to her one by one. Kingship, priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent, the art of lovemaking, the art of music, metalwork, leatherwork, building, wisdom, attentiveness, terror, kindness, and dozens more. The text lists over 60 Me in various versions. Inanna loads these onto her boat and departs for Uruk. When Enki sobers, he realizes what he's given away and sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna successfully escapes with the Me to Uruk, where they become the foundation of that city's cultural prominence. This narrative is remarkable for what it implies: the arts of civilization, writing, music, metalwork, statecraft, religious ritual, are not presented as human invention, but as transferable possessions initially held by the Anunnaki and distributed, sometimes strategically, sometimes accidentally, to human cities. The Mi are described almost technologically. They can be carried, they can be stolen, they convey specific capability. Whoever possesses them possesses the knowledge or power they represent. This is not how mythology typically treats cultural development. Prometheus gives fire, but he doesn't transfer the Mi of combustion technology as a discrete package. But in Sumerian accounts, that's exactly how civilizational capacity is portrayed, as downloadable modules from an external source. The Anunnaki's relationship to humanity is described with unsettling clarity in multiple texts. The Atrahasis epic states directly, "Let him bear the yoke, the task of the gods. Let man carry the load of the gods." Humans were created for labour, not as a side effect of divine affairs, not accidentally, but purposefully. The text describes the creation process, mixing clay with the blood and flesh of a slaughtered god, specifically Weila or Geshtue, a god who possessed intelligence, then having the birth goddess Nintu form humans from this mixture. This is genetic engineering terminology, encoded in the symbolic language available to Bronze Age scribes. The essential elements are present, taking material from one being, divine, presumably meaning genetically superior or different, combining it with earthly matter clay, representing indigenous hominid stock, processing through a biological mechanism the womb of Nintu, and producing a hybrid organism designed for specific function. The text even describes creating multiple versions. In pairs she completed them. In pairs she completed them in her presence. The mother goddess, let her fashion 7 males and 7 females. After humans are created and multiply, the relationship between Anunnaki and humans is consistently described as one of service provision. Humans work the fields. The produce supports the temples. The temples house the Anunnaki. Hymns and ration texts from Nippur, Uruk, and Lagash document regular food offerings to the gods, not as symbolic ritual, but as literal provisioning. The daily ration lists for the temple of Inanna at Uruk, preserved on hundreds of administrative tablets, record specific amounts of bread, beer, meat, and other provisions delivered to the house of the goddess. Were these offerings for statues, or were the statues representations of living beings who required sustenance? The texts don't clearly differentiate, because, from the Sumerian perspective, the question might not have made sense. The Anunnaki were present through their statues in the sense that the statues marked their earthly residence, but the Anunnaki themselves were understood as actual beings who dwelled in the temples when present on earth, and in heaven when absent. This presence/absence pattern appears throughout the literature. Anunnaki come and go. They're not always available. Prayers sometimes lament that a particular deity has departed and must be entreated to return. The lamentation over the destruction of composed after Ur's fall around 2000 BC, describes the gods abandoning their city before destruction arrives. Enlil called the storm, the people mourn. Winds of abundance he took from the land, the people mourn. He brought the storm, the people mourn. The gods leave. Then catastrophe follows. This pattern repeats across multiple city laments. Divine abandonment precedes collapse. If the Anunnaki were purely symbolic representations of natural forces or social structure, why would their abandonment need to be documented as a discrete event preceding material disaster? But if they were actual beings whose presence provided stability, organization, protection, or knowledge, then their departure would logically precipitate systemic collapse. The texts describe it as the latter. The physical descriptions of the Anunnaki are surprisingly sparse and contradictory, which itself is revealing. They're described as larger than humans in some texts, normal-sized in others. They eat, drink, sleep, argue, make mistakes. They're portrayed as powerful but not omnipotent, knowledgeable but not omniscient, long-lived but not necessarily immortal. Some texts hint at Anunnaki deaths or transformation. They reproduce sexually and have offspring, both among themselves and occasionally with humans. The texts mention sons of the gods taking human wives, producing offspring who become heroes or kings. This biological compatibility is significant. If the Anunnaki were purely supernatural beings from an entirely different order of existence, reproduction with humans would be conceptually impossible, like mammals breeding with crystalline structures. But if they were biological entities from elsewhere, with sufficient genetic similarity to humans, such reproduction becomes biologically plausible. The texts treat it matter of fact, without marking it as particularly miraculous, suggesting it fit within understood natural principles, even if uncommon. The most telling detail is what the Anunnaki do. They organize, they teach, they distribute knowledge, they establish systems, they make administrative decisions, they don't perform inexplicable magic, they don't violate natural law, they work within it using superior understanding. Enki doesn't create ex nihilo. He recombines elements. Ningishida teaches medicine by revealing which plants treat which condition. Anu doesn't magically enforce his will. He works through hierarchy and delegation. This is precisely how a civilization with advanced knowledge and technology would appear to a less advanced culture if we stripped away our modern technical vocabulary. Lacking terms for genetic engineering, you'd describe it as mixing clay with divine blood. Lacking terms for agricultural science, you'd describe it as a god teaching the me of farming. Lacking terms for administrative systems, you'd describe it as kingship lowered from heaven. The texts don't claim the Anunnaki were omnipotent, supernatural beings. They claim the Anunnaki were powerful, knowledgeable beings from the sky who organized human civilization, made decisions in councils, operated within rules, possessed and transferred knowledge packages called me, and could be present or absent from their earthly temples. These descriptions are compatible with advanced biological entities, incompatible with purely mythological archetypes, and deeply uncomfortable for modern categories that insist on a binary, either supernatural and therefore unreal, or natural and therefore human. The Sumerians offered a third category, the Anunnaki, real, biological, present, powerful, but not human and not from here. The question is whether this category preserves memory of something actual, and that question leads directly to examining what they came to do, the transfer of the divine powers that built civilization from nothing. Divine powers in clay. In the catalogue of Mesopotamian concepts that resist clean translation, the me stands as perhaps the most significant. Not laws, not qualities, not forces, but something closer to operational principles or civilizational subroutines. The Sumerians understood the me as tangible possessions held by the gods, particularly Enki, that could be given, taken or stolen, and that conferred specific capabilities upon whoever possessed them. The implications of this concept for understanding how the Sumerians viewed the origin of their civilization are profound. The me are listed in multiple texts, most extensively in the narrative Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization, reconstructed from tablets excavated at Nippur, and now scattered across collections including the University of Pennsylvania, the Louvre, and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. The lists vary slightly between versions, but consistently include over 60 specific me, covering every aspect of civilized life. The categories are illuminating. First, governmental and religious authority, encyship, kingship, priestly office, godship, the crown, the throne, the scepter. These aren't described as arising from human social development, but as existing principles that must be possessed to function. You don't develop kingship, you receive the me of king. Second, emotional and psychological states, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, art of lovemaking, art of prostitution, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counselling, judgment, decision. Notably, both positive and negative states are included, peace and strife, truth and deceit, suggesting the me are morally neutral operational principles, not ethical guidelines. Third, practical crafts and technologies, metalworking, leatherworking, building, basketry, woodworking. Each craft is a separate me. You don't figure out metalworking through experimentation, you receive the me of metalworking, which conveys the knowledge as a complete package. Fourth, musical and artistic capabilities, the art of song, musical instruments, the art of the scribe. Music theory, instrumental technique, and writing are transferable knowledge sets. Fifth, social structures and roles, eldership, heroship, straightforwardness, prostitution, speech. Even the capacity for certain types of speech is described as a me that must be possessed. The text describes Inanna's journey to Eridu specifically to acquire these me from Enki. She doesn't ask for general wisdom or blessing. She asks for specific me, and Enki grants them one by one. In the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I shall give them to holy Inanna, the holy me of lordship, the me of kingship, the me of priestly office. The list continues for dozens of lines. Each me is named, acknowledged, and transferred. This transactional nature is critical. The me are property. Enki gives them. Inanna receives them. She then physically transports them. The text describes her loading them onto the boat of heaven for the journey to Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes the political implications of what he's given away, he sends his servant Isimud to retrieve them. Isimud pursues Inanna's boat, confronts her at multiple stops along the journey, but she successfully defends her cargo and arrives at Uruk with the me intact. When Inanna reaches Uruk, the text describes what happens. She brought them into the shrine, Anna. Thereupon she spoke, I have carried off the me from the Abzu to the Anna. The transfer is complete. Uruk now possesses civilizational capability it didn't have before. Not through indigenous development, not through gradual learning, but through acquisition from an external source. Enki's temple at Eridu, and physical transfer to Inanna's temple at Uruk. Archaeological evidence supports Uruk's sudden prominence. During the Uruk period 4003 to 100 BC, Uruk explodes in size and sophistication, becoming the first true city, possibly the largest human settlement in the world at that time, with monumental architecture including the Anu temple complex and Inanna's Eanna temple. The standard archaeological explanation is population aggregation and political centralization, but the texts provide a different explanation. Uruk acquired the Mi, the operational principles of advanced civilization, from Eridu, the older center where Enki held them. Why were the Mi originally at Eridu? Because Eridu was the first city. The king list states, after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The Eridu Genesis describes Eridu as the place where civilization began, where humans were first created, where Enki established his temple. If civilization was installed from an external source, Eridu was the installation site. The Abzu temple at Eridu, excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s, revealed 17 successive temple levels dating back to around 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest temple sites known. The temple's name itself is revealing: Abzu, House of the Abzu. The Abzu was Enki's domain, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, source of all fertility and wisdom. But the term also carries connotations of depth, origin, source. The temple was built over what was believed to be a physical connection to this realm. Excavations revealed that the earliest temple levels had a small room with a basin or pit, interpreted by archaeologists as a ritual water feature, but described in texts as the entry point to the Abzu itself, where Enki dwelled and from which he emerged. The texts describe Enki as the guardian of the Mi, but they don't claim he created them. In some accounts they existed before the current order of gods, part of the fundamental structure of reality. Enki's role was stewardship, keeping them, understanding them, and distributing them appropriately to establish civilization. His wisdom wasn't moral or philosophical primarily, it was technical. He knew how things worked. Multiple texts describe Enki using the Mi to establish various aspects of civilization. The Enki and the World Order text details how Enki travelled to different regions, bringing the Mi and establishing their function. Father Enki made it come forth from the earth like a plant. He determined the Mi. Enki placed in charge. The repetitive structure emphasizes systematic implementation. This wasn't random development, it was planned rollout of pre-existing systems. One passage describes Enki establishing agriculture. He established the farms, he set up boundaries, perfected furrows and rows, he put the yoke upon the oxen, he opened the holy furrows, made barley grow, he established the plough, the yoke, the harness, the whip, each element of agricultural. Technology is specified. This reads like a technology transfer checklist: plough design, yoke mechanics, harness configuration, crop selection. Not he blessed the fields, but he established these specific tools and methods. Another section describes Enki organising maritime trade. He directed the holy Mi toward the sea. He made the great surge come forth. He pointed the prow of boats toward the harbour. He put the Mi of the Magur boat into the hands of the sailor. Note again the specificity. Boats of particular design, purarotes, were large cargo vessels. Navigation toward harbours, established warts. Mi placed into the hands of practitioners, knowledge transfer to humans who would operate the systems. The Mi were not given to humanity at large, but to specific individuals in specific roles. Kings received the Mi of kingship. Priests received the Mi of priestly office. Craftsmen received the Mi of their crafts. This selective distribution meant civilization wasn't democratically available. It was hierarchically structured from its origin. Those who possessed the appropriate Mi had capability. Those who didn't lacked them. This creates an obvious question. How were the Mi transferred? The texts describe the transfer sometimes as verbal instruction, sometimes as physical gifting, sometimes as investiture ceremony. When a new king was installed, the coronation ritual involved receiving the Mi of kingship from the god of that city. This wasn't symbolic. The ritual was understood as a real transfer of operational authority and capability. The Curse of Agade, a text describing the fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BC, attributes the collapse to the withdrawal of divine favour, specifically framed as the withdrawal of the Mi from the city. The princes of the land became very sombre. The foreign lands became hostile. From east to west there was fear. From south to north there was panic. The nobles scattered. The Mi of the city Enlil took away. When the Mi are withdrawn, the capacity for civilized order collapses. The text describes systematic breakdown, agricultural failure, economic collapse, invasion, depopulation. This pattern, Mi as enabling civilization, removal of me causing civilizational collapse, suggests the Sumerians understood their civilization as dependent on something external to themselves, not merely guided by gods in a vague providential sense, but structurally dependent on specific knowledge and organizational principles held and distributed by the Anunnaki. Without the me, without the continuous presence, or at least the retained knowledge from the Anunnaki, civilization couldn't maintain itself. Modern analogy might help clarify without overstating. Consider a franchise. The franchisor holds the operational manual, the proprietary recipes, the business system. Franchisees receive these systems, implement them, and can operate successfully as long as they maintain connection to the source and follow the procedures. If the franchisor withdraws support, revokes the license, or stops training new managers, the individual franchises may continue for a while on momentum, but they'll gradually diverge, degrade, or collapse. The Sumerian text describes something similar. The Anunnaki held the me, the operational principles of civilization. They distributed them to humanity through specific individuals and institutions. As long as the connection remained, as long as the temples functioned, as long as the knowledge was passed down, civilization continued. But if the Anunnaki withdrew, if the temples were destroyed, if the knowledge was lost, the system would fail. This is not how we're taught to think about civilization. We're taught that humans gradually developed agriculture, then craft, then cities, then writing, through incremental innovation over millennia, trial and error, cultural evolution. But the Sumerian texts describe instantiation, civilization as an installed system, pre-designed, complete in its initial form, requiring maintenance and transmission, but not requiring invention because it was never invented by humans in the first place. If this interpretation holds any truth, if the me represent real knowledge packages transferred from a more advanced source, then the texts preserve documentation of exactly what the title of this investigation claims: external influence on the rise of civilization. Not vague inspiration or cultural contact, but systematic knowledge transfer. The Anunnaki, particularly Enki, possessed comprehensive understanding of how to organize human society, and they implemented that understanding through structured transfer of the me. But knowledge alone doesn't explain everything. Knowledge can be lost. Systems can collapse. The text describes something beyond initial installation. They describe ongoing maintenance, intervention, and a particular class of beings whose role was specifically to preserve and transmit civilization's foundational knowledge through catastrophe. The 7 sages who came before the flood and remained after it, teaching humanity what it needed to survive. The architects beneath the waves. Among the most enigmatic figures in Mesopotamian tradition are the Apkallu, the 7 sages who predate the flood, who were sent by Enki from Eridu to teach humanity the arts of civilization, and who appear repeatedly in texts as the fundamental transmitters of knowledge across the catastrophic boundary between the antediluvian world and the present age. The term Apkallu, Sumerian, Abgol, great, refers specifically to these 7 figures. They're not gods but something else, demigods, according to some translation, or as the texts often put it, beings who were wise, who came from the water, who possessed extraordinary knowledge, and whose teachings established civilization. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, but drawing on Babylonian temple archives, provided the most detailed description of these beings, calling them Oans and others of his kind. Berossus's account, preserved in fragments quoted by later historians like Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius, describes Oannes as emerging from the sea at the shore of the Persian Gulf. The text states, "In the first year there appeared from the Red Sea, in the region which is close to Babylon, an animal with reason, whose name was Oannes. The whole body of the animal was like a fish, and under the fish's head it had another head, and at the bottom feet, similar to those of a man, and it had a fish's tail. Its voice and language were articulate and human." Modern readers immediately categorize this as mythological, a fish man, clearly impossible, therefore fiction. But strip away the assumed impossibility and examine what's being described: a being that lives in water, has some physiological adaptation to that environment, but possesses human intelligence, human speech, and human-compatible extremities, allowing it to walk on land and interact with humans. If we encountered such a being today, we'd categorize it as an intelligent non-human species, possibly amphibious. With technological aids, the fish body might be a suit, vehicle, or habitat. Ancient witnesses lacked such conceptual frameworks and described what they saw in terms available to them: fish body, human head, articulate speech. The account continues. This being was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food at the time, and he gave them knowledge of letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize their lives. From that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instruction. This is comprehensive knowledge transfer: writing, mathematics, architecture, law, agriculture, urban planning, religious institutions. And the final sentence is critical: nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instruction. Meaning, in Berossus's understanding, civilization as it existed in his time was essentially what Oannes had taught, not gradually developed since then, but implemented from that teaching and maintained since. Berossus describes the pattern. When the sun set, it was the custom of this animal to plunge again into the sea and abide all night in the deep, for he was amphibious. Oannes didn't remain among humans continuously. He emerged, taught, then returned to the water. This pattern of periodic presence and absence matches the pattern described throughout Mesopotamian texts regarding the Anunnaki generally. They came, intervened, then withdrew. Berossus also states there were 7 such beings across the antediluvian period. In the time of Alexander, son of Philip the Prince, records were extracted from the sacred writing, which tell that before the flood there reigned 10 kings during 120 sars, which amount to 432,000 years. After the flood, 10 kings, who were called shepherds, ruled 365,000 years. The 7 Apkallu operated during this antediluvian period, each associated with one of the antediluvian cities and kings. Mesopotamian temple texts from Uruk, particularly those from the Seleucid period, date 4th and centuries Pshur, but based on earlier sources, list the 7 Apkallu by name and associate each with one of the antediluvian kings. Uana, associated with Alulimov. Eridu, Uaneduga associated with Alolgar of Eridu. Emaduga associated with Enmen Luana of Bad Tibira. Emagalama associated with Enmen Gal Ana of Bad Tibira. Emebeluga associated with Dumazid of Bad Tibira, and Enlilda associated with Ensipaziana of Larak. Utuabzu associated with Enmen Duana of Sipa. The final name is significant. Utuabzu's associated king, Enmen Durana, is the 7th antediluvian king, often identified as the Sumerian equivalent of Enoch, who in Genesis walked with God and was taken to heaven without dying. Mesopotamian tradition holds that Enmen Durana received special training from Utuabzu in divination, temple rites, and the secret wisdom of the Apkallu, which he then transmitted to post-flood priesthood. This creates a chain of knowledge transmission. Enki Apkallu Enmen Durana, post-flood priest. After the flood, the tradition changes. No more pure Apkallu appear. Instead, the texts refer to human sages who carry on the tradition, sometimes called Apkallu of human descent, to distinguish them from the original 7. This transition is critical. The original Apkallu were not human. They came from the water. They were sent by Enki. After the flood, their direct presence ended, but their knowledge continued through human lineages they had trained. Ritual texts from Mesopotamian temples include apotropaic prayers invoking the 7 Apkallu for protection against evil. These prayers describe the Apkallu as 7 sages of the Abzu, reinforcing their connection to Enki's realm. They're credited with establishing the proper functioning of temple, the correct performance of rituals, and the transmission of wisdom. They're not worshipped as gods, but invoked as protective ancestral teachers. Archaeological evidence adds an intriguing dimension. Throughout Mesopotamian art, from Sumerian through Neo-Assyrian periods, a recurring motif appears: hybrid beings, often human-headed with bird or fish bodies, depicted in protective or teaching roles. Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs, particularly those from Nimrud and Khorsabad 8th, 7th centuries, show these figures positioned at doorways, holding buckets and cone-like objects, performing what appear to be purification or blessing rituals. Inscriptions identify some of these figures as Apkallu. The Apkallu figures in art are sometimes shown as bearded men with wings, sometimes as fish-cloaked humans, sometimes with bird features. What's consistent is their liminal nature. They combine human and non-human characteristics. They occupy thresholds, and they perform protective, destructive function. They mediate between realms. The Era Epic, a Babylonian text from the 8th century BC, contains a revealing passage where the god Marduk laments the loss of craftsmen who could properly maintain his statue and temple. Where is Nin Ildu, the master craftsman, who carries the pure rites of Apsu? Where is the precious stone, product of the broad sea, the ornament of my majesty? Where are the 7 sages of Apsu, the pure Purdufi, who like their lord Ea are perfect in lofty wisdom, who can renew my body? This passage explicitly connects the Apkallu, 7 sages of Apsu, Abzu, with specific technical knowledgemanship, proper ritual performance, maintenance of sacred objects that has been lost. Marduk can't find craftsmen capable of the work because the original teachers, the Apkallu, are gone. Human apprentices learned imperfectly or forgot. Without the original source maintaining quality control, degradation occurred. This theme, knowledge degradation after the source withdraws, appears throughout later Mesopotamian literature. The sense that current practitioners can't match ancient standards, that original wisdom has been partially lost, that modern civilization is a faded copy of something more complete. This is the opposite of progressive narratives where each generation improves on the last. Instead, there's civilizational nostalgia, not for primitive simplicity, but for sophisticated knowledge that once existed and has been diminished. If the Obkalu tradition preserves historical memory, what does it suggest? That before the flood, 7 non-human intelligent beings associated with water, Abzu/Enki, taught humanity the foundational skills of civilization across the span of 7 antediluvian reigns. These beings were not permanently present, but periodically emerged, instructed, then returned to their Abzu habitat. Their teachings were comprehensive enough that post-flood civilization could be rebuilt based on them, transmitted through the single lineage of En-men, Jur-Ana Ziusudra, who survived the catastrophe with that knowledge preserved. The flood becomes, in this framework, not primarily a moral judgment or natural disaster, but a catastrophic interruption of knowledge transmission. The question the Anunnaki Council faced wasn't whether humanity deserved punishment, but whether the human experiment should be terminated or preserved. Enki, through his warning to Ziusudra/Atrahasis, ensured that preservation, and specifically that the knowledge held by the Apkallu-trained lineage would survive. What did Ziusudra bring onto the boat? The Gilgamesh flood account specifies, "All that I had of the seed of all living creatures I loaded aboard." Standard interpretation reads this as animals and plants. But seed in Sumerian and Akkadian can mean genetic stock or fundamental knowledge. What if what was preserved was not merely breeding pairs, but the me themselves, the knowledge packages that allowed civilization to restart? The instructions of Shuruppak, given by the last antediluvian king to his son Ziusudra, could be understood as this knowledge transfer in action. Here is what you must remember. Here is how things work. Here is what must be preserved across the catastrophe. The text's practical wisdom isn't random folk sayings, but a distilled manual for maintaining civilized order under future uncertain conditions. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again. But this time there's a difference. No new Apkallu appear. The teaching function is transferred to human priestly lineages who claim descent from Ziusudra, who carry the Apkallu tradition, who maintain the temples where the me are kept, but who lack the direct access to the source that the original 7 provided. Civilization continues, but the feedback loop is broken. When problems arise, when knowledge is questioned, when innovations are needed, there are no Apkallu to emerge from the Abzu and correct course. This might explain the patterns seen throughout Mesopotamian history: remarkable initial fluorescence Uruk period, early dynastic, followed by gradual entropy, occasional revival Akkadian Empire, Third, Babylonian periods, but with a sense throughout later texts that something has been lost, that the ancients knew more, that modern practices are shadows of original perfection. The 7 Apkallu, if they existed as something more than myth, represent a specific mechanism of knowledge transfer, long-lived or periodically returned non-human teachers who maintained civilization across generations by direct instruction. Their withdrawal after the flood might represent planned obsolescence. Humanity was meant to eventually stand on its own, or forced absence due to changed conditions. The texts don't specify why the Apkallu didn't return after the flood. They simply note the transition to human sages. Perhaps the flood changed Earth conditions enough that the Apkallu couldn't survive extended periods on land anymore. Perhaps their mission was complete and they returned to wherever they came from. Perhaps they perished in the flood, along with most of humanity, with only their legacy teachings surviving. The texts preserve the fact of their prior present and their absence after the flood, but not the reason for that absence. What they do preserve is the mechanism by which civilization was initially established, not through blind evolutionary fumbling, but through deliberate teaching by knowledgeable instructors sent by Enki from the Abzu. And they preserve the memory of 7 specific individuals who performed this function during the antediluvian period, whose knowledge was critical enough that its preservation through the flood determined whether post-flood humanity could rebuild or would descend into permanent chaos. The question then becomes, why was the flood necessary at all? If civilization was functioning, if the Apkallu were teaching, if humanity was established, why did the Anunnaki Council decide destruction was preferable to continuation? The texts provide an answer, but it's not the one most people expect. When heaven deliberated annihilation. The biblical flood narrative attributes the deluge to human wickedness. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. This is a moral judgment. Humanity had become irredeemably corrupt and required purging. Noah is saved because he alone was righteous. The narrative fits a framework of divine justice, sin, judgment, punishment, redemption for the faithful remnant. The Mesopotamian flood accounts present something far more unsettling. The flood was not punishment for moral failure, but elimination of a noise problem. The Atrahasis epic provides the most explicit version. After describing humanity's creation and multiplication, the text states, 1200 years had not yet passed when the land extended, and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. This is not moral judgment. This is irritation. Humanity has become too numerous, too active, too loud. The problem isn't sin, but success. Humans have multiplied and established civilization to the point where their collective activity disturbs Enlil's rest. His solution: cut off food supplies to the people. Let sickness, pestilence, and plague oppress them. The text describes Enlil attempting various methods of population reduction short of total extinction. First plague. Enlil made his voice heard and spoke to the great gods. Let the pestilence fall upon mankind. The plague comes. Humans die. But Enki intervenes, teaching the human sage Atrahasis how to appeal to Namtar, the plague god, and the plague ends. Population recovers. The noise returns. Enlil tries again, this time with drought. Let rainfall be withheld from above. Let water from below not rise from the springs. Let the wind blow and parch the ground. Let the clouds thicken but not release a downpour. The drought comes. Famine follows. Humans die in massive numbers. The text describes horrific conditions. The people's looks were changed by hunger. Their faces were encrusted with scabs. But again Enki subverts the plan, teaching humans to appeal to Adad the storm god, and rain returns. By now the pattern is clear. Enlil wants population control. Enki keeps undermining him. This is not merely philosophical disagreement, it's political conflict between Anunnaki factions with different interests. Enlil, governing Earth's atmosphere and surface, finds human activity intrusive. Enki, having designed humans in the first place and presumably invested in their success, protects them. After the drought fails, Enlil escalates to final solution: total flood. But this time he doesn't merely decree it, he requires an oath from the other Anunnaki. The text specifies the gods, the Anunnaki, took an oath to keep the flood secret. This is conspiracy. Enlil knows Enki will interfere again, so he binds all the Anunnaki by oath not to reveal the plan to humanity. The oath is serious. Violation would mean serious consequences for Enki. Enki finds a workaround that honours the letter of the oath while violating its spirit. He doesn't speak directly to Atrahasis. Instead, he addresses a reed wall. Knowing Atrahasis is on the other side, reed wall, 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 reed wall, here, wall, consider. Man of Shurupak, son of Ubartutu, demolish the house, build a boat, reject possessions and save life. He provides detailed specifications for the boat, dimensions, design, waterproofing methods, loading procedures. Why does Enki go to such lengths to preserve humanity against Enlil's decision? The text implies it's not pure benevolence. Enki designed humans for a purpose, to perform the labour the Igigi refused. If humans are exterminated, that purpose fails, and the original problem returns. Who does the work? Enlil might not care, he'd prefer silence. But Enki has investment in the system function. The flood comes. The Gilgamesh version tablet K3375 provides the most dramatic description, recounted by Utnapishtim, the Akkadian equivalent of Atrahasis/Yusudra. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew. The flood and storm ravaged the earth. On the 7th day the storm subsided, the sea calmed, the flood ceased. When Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out, he sees all of humanity had returned to clay. The landscape was as flat as a rooftop. Then comes the remarkable moment. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush, identified by scholars as part of the Zagros mountain in modern-day Kurdistan. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test whether dry land has appeared. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. When the raven doesn't return, Haviau Naud, Utnapishtim knows land is emerging. He exits the boat and performs a sacrifice. I offered incense on the peak of the mountain. 7 and 7 cult vessels I put in place. Upon their pot stands I heaped reeds, cedar, and myrtle. The next passage is crucial. The gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. They're hungry. During the flood, while humanity was drowned, who was providing the temple offerings? No one. The gods have been without their regular provision. Utnapishtim's sacrifice is the first food they've had in weeks. Enlil arrives and is furious. Where did life escape? No man was to survive the destruction. Enki's betrayal is obvious. Confrontation follows. But then Enki and Idinur responds, Yo, the sage of the gods, the warrior, how could you so irrationally bring on the flood? Impose punishment on the sinner for his sin. Impose penalty on the criminal for his crime. But be lenient, lest he be cut off. Be patient, lest he be dislodged. This is political argument, not moral. Ea isn't claiming humans were innocent. He's arguing that genocide is poor policy. But more than that, he points out the practical consequence. Instead of you bringing on the flood, a lion could have risen up and diminished the people. Instead of you bringing on the flood, a wolf could have risen up and diminished the people. Instead of you bringing on the flood, a famine could have risen up and destroyed the land. Instead of you bringing on the flood, pestilence could have risen up and slaughtered the people. In other words, there were more measured options. Enlil went for maximum response to a manageable problem. The argument works not because it's morally superior, but because it's administratively sound. You don't demolish the building because tenants are noisy. You soundproof, impose quiet hours, or selectively evict. The outcome is telling. Enlil relents, but not entirely. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality and removed to the mouth of the rivers, where they'll live apart from humanity. This is retirement, not reward. They're sequestered. And Enlil implements new population control measures. Henceforth there shall be a new order. Let there be women who shall not bear. Let there be demons who snatch babies. Let there be priestesses who are prohibited from childbirth. This is population engineering. Introduce sterility, infant mortality, celibate classes, anything to keep numbers manageable. The system continue, humans can work, but population will be constrained below the noise threshold that disturbed Enlil. Multiple Sumerian and Akkadian sources corroborate this account structure. The Eridu Genesis CBS 1673, though fragmentary, follows the same pattern: noise, divine counsel, flood decision, warning to Ziusudra, flood, survival, new order. The consistency across independent sources suggests this wasn't arbitrary literary invention, but standardized account of what happened. What's absent from the Mesopotamian versions is moral justification. Humans aren't described as wicked or corrupt. The instructions of Shuruppak, supposedly taught just before the flood, contain ethical advice, suggesting humans were still capable of ethical behavior. The flood decision is political and practical, not moral. This creates profound theological discomfort. Gods who destroy civilizations not because those civilizations are evil, but because they're inconvenient, unless the framework changes. If we remove the assumption that these beings are gods in the omnipotent sense, and treat them instead as advanced biological entities with their own interests, limitations, and power struggles, the account becomes eerily plausible. A created workforce multiplies beyond planned parameters. Noise, electromagnetic, psychic, simply acoustic, becomes problematic for the creator. Authority figure wants termination. Designer wants preservation. Political conflict ensues. Termination proceeds, but is partially sabotaged. Compromise is reached. Small population survives under new constraints. The flood mechanism itself might not be purely natural. The texts describe gods opening the fountains of the deep and opening the windows of heaven. This suggests active causation, not passive waiting for a weather event. Could a civilization capable of creating humanity also have means of triggering large-scale flooding? Water release from polar ice, targeted meteor impact in oceans, manipulation of tectonic activity. The mechanism isn't specified. Only the agency, the Anunnaki Council, decided. They acted. Flood resulted. Dating the flood remains problematic. The Sumerian king list places it in the distant past with impossible chronology. Geological evidence shows multiple regional flood events in Mesopotamian history. Major inundations around 2900 BC, others earlier and later. Perhaps the textual memory conflates multiple events, or perhaps a single catastrophic event around the end of the last ice age, 11,000, 10,000 Book, when rapid sea level rise submerged coastal areas, where early civilizations would logically develop, and that memory persisted through millennia of oral tradition before being written down. Regardless of dating precision, the text preserves something distinctive, an account where civilization's near extinction wasn't punishment for human failure, but consequence of political conflict among the beings who created or uplifted humanity in the first place. Humanity survived not through righteousness, but through one faction's protection of their investment. The pattern is not moral drama, but bureaucratic infighting with humanity caught in the middle. And critically, the survivor isn't just any human. Ziusudra/Atrahasis/Utnapishtim is specifically identified as the son of Ubar-Tutu, last antediluvian king, who received instruction from Shuruppak, who had been taught by the Apkallu. The flood survivor is knowledge keeper lineage. What was preserved wasn't merely human genetic stock, but the civilizational knowledge necessary to rebuild. The boat contained not just animals, but the me, or at least the understanding of how to access and implement them. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. But the texts are clear, this isn't new installation. This is restoration. The same structures, the same administrative system, the same divine human interface, rebuilt, not reinvented. Post-flood civilization looks like pre-flood civilization because it's designed by the same architects working from the same blueprint. This leads to a question the texts themselves raise but don't fully answer. If the Anunnaki could survive the flood, if they still existed afterward, if they re-established the system, why didn't they just prevent the flood? Enki's power was sufficient to save one human family. Why not exercise sufficient power to veto Enlil's plan entirely? The answer seems to be hierarchical limitation. Enki could subvert, but not override. The council's decision, once formalized and oath-bound, had to proceed. This suggests rules, protocols, authorities that even the most powerful Anunnaki couldn't simply ignore. They operated within structure, not as unrestricted agents. And if that's true, if the Anunnaki were bound by rules and hierarchies they didn't fully control, then they might be subject to other constraints as well. Constraints that could explain not just the flood, but the later pattern of divine withdrawal, temple abandonment, civilizational collapse, because the flood wasn't the last time the world ended. It was only the first documented time. And the pattern would repeat, the survivors and their secrets. In every flood tradition across Mesopotamian sources, the survivor is never randomly selected. Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic all share critical characteristics. They are from royal lineage, they have been taught by sages, and they are specifically chosen by Enki to preserve something beyond mere biological survival. The genealogy is precise. The Sumerian king list identifies Ziusudra as the son of Ubar-Tutu, the eighth and final antediluvian king who ruled in Shuruppak. The instructions of Shuruppak preserve the teaching given by Shuruppak, the city's eponymous king, possibly an alternate name or predecessor of Ubar-Tutu to his son Ziusudra. This text, dating to approximately 2600 BC in its earliest written form, but claiming to preserve much older oral tradition, begins, in those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far remote years. At that time the wise one who knew how to speak in elaborate words lived in the land. Shuruppak, the wise one, who knew how to speak in elaborate words, lived in the land. Shuruppak gave instructions to his son. The instructions themselves are revealing. They're not mystical or esoteric. They're practical guidance for maintaining stability in uncertain conditions. My son, let me give you instructions. You should not ignore my instruction. Let me say something to you, you should pay attention. Do not neglect my advice. Then follows advice about social relationships, how to deal with authorities, how to avoid conflict, how to maintain reputation, when to speak and when to remain silent. About women, you should not drive away a woman of the public square who seeks you out. You should not drive away such a woman from the square. She is a precious ornament of great gods. About property, you should not choose a wife during a festival. Her appearance will disseminate. You should not pick a quarrel in your house or the square. The rabble will hear the commotion. About justice, you should not vouch for someone. That man will have a hold on you. But you should not vouch for yourself either. You will be questioned. This is worldly wisdom for navigating a complex society with legal systems, property disputes, class distinctions, public reputation concerns, not advice for primitive survival. The fact that this text is framed as teaching given just before the flood suggests the pre-flood world had sophisticated social organization requiring sophisticated navigation strategy. Critically, the final surviving fragments hint at the transmission purpose. Ziusudra, let me speak to you. Pay attention to my advice. Do not neglect my instruction. The flood, the text breaks off before completing what was clearly a warning or preparation for what was coming. But the structure is clear. Knowledge transfer from father to son, from antediluvian king to flood survivor, ensuring continuity across the catastrophe. What exactly did Ziusudra preserve? The texts provide clues. Beyond the animals and seeds, beyond the architectural specifications for the boat, the flood hero preserves the understanding of how civilization functions, the me, or at minimum, access. When Utnapishtim describes his preparations in the Gilgamesh account, he says, "All that I had I loaded aboard, all the silver I had I loaded aboard, all the gold I had I loaded aboard, all the living creatures I had I loaded aboard." Silver and gold aren't useful for immediate survival, but are essential for re-establishing trade, currency, status markers, economic infrastructure. More significantly, after the flood, Utnapishtim performs a sacrifice using specific materials, seed, cedar, myrrh, in specific quantities, 7 vuls, on a high place. This isn't improvised survival ritual. This is temple protocol, performed correctly, suggesting he carries not just general religious knowledge, but specific liturgical procedure. Where did he learn these? From the antediluvian traditions maintained through his father's line, and ultimately from the Apkallu who taught those traditions. The Babylonian theodicy a wisdom text from around 1000 BC, contains a remarkable passage where the protagonist complains about the injustice of the world and receives this response: the primeval ocean, the king of the gods bestowed on twisted mankind perverse speech. The mistress of the gods gave perverse speech to the human race. In falsehood they speak, but Ea, the king, created mankind. With lies did the queen of the gods, Nintu, compose mankind. This passage attributes humanity's flawed nature to divine design choices. But it also reveals that Ea Enki is understood as having direct involvement in humanity's creation and characteristic, not merely general creator, but specific engineer making specific choices. The flood survivor, being from the lineage most closely associated with Enki's teaching line, Shurupak Zusudra, represents preservation of the most complete knowledge. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven to Kish, not Shurupak. This is significant. The new order isn't centered in the old knowledge-keeping location. Perhaps Shurupak was destroyed. Perhaps the flood reshuffled geography enough that old sites were unusable. Regardless, the post-flood world required re-establishment, and the survivors' knowledge was critical to that process. Later Mesopotamian royal inscriptions frequently claim descent from or connection to antediluvian lineages. Kings of Uruk trace their legitimacy back through Gilgamesh, who was part god, whose ancestor was the flood hero. Kings of Lagash, Ur, and other cities similarly claimed ancient pedigree. This wasn't merely propaganda. In a system where kingship and civilizational knowledge were understood as descending from heaven through specific channels, demonstrating lineage connection to those channels was claiming access to legitimacy and knowledge that others lacked. The transition from antediluvian to post-diluvian is also a transition in human Anunnaki interaction. Before the flood, texts describe more direct interaction. The Obkalu emerge regularly to teach. Gods walk among humans. After the flood, the pattern changes. Divine presence becomes more intermittent, more mediated through temples and priesthood. The Anunnaki are still involved, kingship still descends from heaven, temples still function as their earthly houses, but the immediacy decreases. This shift might explain the development of temple prostitution, oracular practices, divination systems, mechanisms for accessing divine knowledge when direct teaching is no longer available. If the Apkallu aren't emerging anymore, if the Anunnaki aren't walking the streets, how do you maintain the connection necessary for civilization to continue? You develop specialized priesthoods, trained in the preserved knowledge. You create rituals that invoke divine presence. You establish divination systems that claim to access divine will. Ziggurats, the massive stepped temple towers built across Mesopotamia, can be understood in this context. The most famous, the Atemenanki Ziggurat of Babylon, the likely inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, was called the foundation of heaven and earth. Its summit temple was the designated meeting place between heaven and earth, where the god Marduk would descend when visiting his earthly city. This wasn't metaphorical. The temple's top level was maintained with a bed, table, and provisions for Marduk's use when present. Did anyone ever witness Marduk occupying that space? Temple records don't specify, but the maintenance was continuous for centuries, suggesting either genuine periodic occupation or, at minimum, the genuine belief that such occupation was possible and necessary to provide for. The ziggurat's architecture, rising in stages from ground to apex, suggests a designed interface. Humans ascend from below, gods descend from above. Meeting occurs at the midpoint. Post-flood humanity, according to the text, is deliberately more constrained than antediluvian humanity. The Atrahasis account specifies that new population controls were implemented, increased infant mortality, classes of non-reproducing women, shorter lifespans. The Genesis account parallels this. Antediluvian patriarchs lived 900 plus years. Post-flood lifespans rapidly declined to 100, 120. Whether this represents literal biological change or symbolic compression of genealogies is debated, but the texts agree something changed after the flood that limited human capacity. Yet what was preserved ensured civilization could rebuild. Within a few centuries of the archaeological flood horizon, whichever flood event the texts remember, the Uruk period fluorescence occurs. Massive city, monumental architecture, writing, complex administration. This matches the textual pattern. Catastrophe, then rapid restoration based on preserved knowledge, not slow reinvention. The figure of Gilgamesh, who ruled Uruk several generations after the flood according to the king list, embodies the post-flood human condition. He's described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, suggesting hybrid ancestry, possibly from earlier interbreeding between Anunnaki and humans. He's immensely powerful, accomplishes great feats, but is mortal. He seeks immortality by journeying to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life. When Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim's remote dwelling at the mouth of the rivers, he demands the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim tells him the flood story, explaining that his immortality was a unique gift due to unique circumstances. Gilgamesh presses, there must be a way. Utnapishtim presents a test, stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh fails immediately, falling asleep. When awakened, he argues he only slept a moment. Utnapishtim points to 7 loaves of bread, 1 baked each day Gilgamesh slept, progressively more mouldy, proving 7 days passed. Gilgamesh is forced to accept his mortality, yet Utnapishtim, at his wife's urging, offers consolation, a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives, retrieves it, begins the journey home, planning to share it with the elders of Uruk, so everyone can benefit. But during a stop to bathe, a serpent steals the plant. Gilgamesh weeps. He returns to Uruk empty-handed. This narrative encodes post-flood human limits. Immortality was available before, was lost, is no longer accessible, except by accident of timing Utnapishtim's survival. Even the secondary prize, perpetual youth, slips away through inattention. Humanity must accept mortality, limited lifespans, and the need to pass knowledge generationally, rather than accumulating it within single individuals across millennia. But knowledge can still be passed. The instructions of Shuruppak did reach Yasudra. The Me did survive. The temple systems did continue. Post-flood humanity was mortal and constrained, but not severed from the source. As long as the temples functioned, as long as priests maintained the rituals, as long as the knowledge was transmitted, civilization persists. The question was, how long would the source remain accessible? The flood demonstrated that the Anunnaki Council could decide to withdraw support, could choose destruction over continuation, could impose new constraints when old arrangements became problematic. If they did it once, they could do it again. And the text suggests they did, repeatedly, across the centuries that followed, as city after city experienced divine abandonment and collapse. Kingship descended from above, again. The phrase appears twice in the World Blundell prism. First, after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then, after listing the antediluvian kings and their impossibly long reigns, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. This repetition is not poetic emphasis. It's documentary notation of 2 separate events with the same mechanism. Kingship descending from heaven. Not emerging from human political development, not gradually consolidating from tribal chiefdoms, but descending, implying origin from above, installation from external source, identical in nature both times. The post-flood section of the king list presents 23 dynasties spanning multiple cities: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Hamazi, Adab, Mari, Akshak, Akkad, Lagash, and others. Each dynasty's duration is listed with precision. Early post-flood reigns are still extraordinary by modern standards, hundreds of years, but drastically shorter than the antediluvian tens of thousands. As the list progresses toward historical periods, reign lengths approach normal human lifespans, eventually matching archaeological and historical records precisely. This gradual normalization suggests the list preserves actual chronology, compressed and distorted in earlier sections, but becoming accurate as it approaches periods with independent verification. The first Kish dynasty lists kings with reigns of 1200, 960, 670 years. Still impossible, but an order of magnitude less impossible than antediluvian reigns. By the time the list reaches the Akkadian Empire, 2334 to 154 BX, the reigns match historical records exactly. Sargon 56 years, Ramush 9 years, Manishtusu 15 years. This isn't fiction, it's archive. The transition point is revealing. Somewhere between the impossible and the historical lies a boundary where memory becomes documentation, where oral tradition crystallizes into written record. That boundary appears to be around 3000 BC, precisely when writing itself appears. Before writing, transmission was oral, subject to distortion, compression, mythologization. After writing, precision improves dramatically, but the content of what's recorded suggests the institutional continuity spans that boundary. Kingship in the post-flood period is described with the same terminology, the same divine legitimation, the same relationship to the gods as in the antediluvian period. The structure is identical, only the scale differs. This implies the system was understood as the same system, restored after catastrophe, maintaining original design. What was that system? The text described kingship not as human political arrangement, but as divine institution. Kings are appointed by gods, sometimes explicitly. The king list often notes which god granted kingship to which city. In Eridu, kingship. In Bad Tibira, kingship, the shift between cities, is attributed to divine decision. Kish was defeated. Its kingship was carried to Uruk, not conquered and absorbed through human politics alone, but transferred by divine decree. Royal inscriptions from the early dynastic period, 2900 2350 consistently attribute authority to divine appointment. Eonatum of Lagash, 2500 Beeks, describes how Enlil granted him kingship, how Inanna gave him weapons, how Enki gave him wisdom. These aren't vague blessings, but specific transfers of authority and capability. The me of kingship, the me of warfare, the me of administration. The king functions only insofar as he possesses these divine grants. This creates structural dependence. A king without divine sanction isn't merely illegitimate politically. He lacks the operational capacity to rule effectively. The me of kingship isn't crown and throne as physical objects, but the knowledge, authority, and perhaps even cognitive capability to manage complex civilization. Without it, administration collapses into chaos, regardless of military power or personal charisma. The Sumerian king list includes remarkable interludes describing civilization-level accomplishments during certain reigns. Meskiag Gasha, son of the sun god Utu, became high priest as well as king, and ruled for 324 years. Meskiag Gasha entered the sea and came out at the mountain. What does it mean that a king entered the sea and came out at the mountain? Standard interpretation treats this as garbled mythology. But if we allow that the text attempts to describe something real using available terminology, perhaps it records an achievement: maritime navigation from the coast to distant highlands, exploration, trade route establishment. Similarly, Enmerkar, son of Meskiag Gasha, the king of Uruk, who built Uruk, reigned for 420 years. Enmerkar is credited with building Uruk, not founding it, already exists, but building it in its monumental form. Archaeological evidence shows Uruk underwent massive expansion during the mid-4th millennium BC, becoming the first true city with populations of tens of thousands and monumental architecture, including the Anu Temple District and Inanna's Eanna Temple Complex. The text attributes this to a specific ruler who reigned impossibly long, suggesting either compression of multiple successive builders into single legendary figure, or genuine longevity of post-flood humans retained some extended lifespan. Enmerkar's reign includes the epic Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta describing conflict with the distant city of Aratta, possibly in Iraq, over tribute and resources. The narrative includes a remarkable passage describing the invention, or perhaps recovery, of writing. Because the messenger's mouth was too heavy, and he could not repeat the message, the Lord of Kulaba patted some clay and put words on it, as if on a tablet. Until then, there had been no putting of words on clay. This attributes writing's appearance to practical necessity. Messages were too complex for oral transmission alone, requiring fixed record. If kingship descended from heaven twice, writing might have as well: initial installation antediluvian, lost in flood, then restored post-flood when administrative complexity again required it. The sudden appearance of already sophisticated writings around 3200 BC, without clear developmental precursors, fits a restoration model better than pure invention model. The earliest tablets from Uruk are administrative, ration lists, personnel assignments, land records, not primitive scrawlings but functional bureaucratic tools, as if writing served its purpose from day one, because that purpose was its reason for restoration. The early dynastic period shows remarkable consistency in administrative structure across independent city-states. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Adab, Nippur, each had temple complexes with similar architectural plans. Each had priests called by similar titles. Each had administrative systems using similar accounting methods. Each had military structures with similar organization. This standardization suggests common source, common training, common template. If kingship descended from heaven as a complete system, these would be features of that implemented consistently wherever the system was installed. Nippur held special status. Though rarely a political capital, Nippur was the religious center of Sumer, home of Enlil's primary temple, the Eka. Kingship wasn't legitimate unless confirmed at Nippur. Rulers from other cities would journey to Nippur to receive recognition from Enlil's priests. Why? If kingship was a me held by Enlil, transferable only through his authority, then his temple at Nippur was the administrative center where such transfers were authorized. Political power might be exercised from Uruk or Ur, but legitimacy originated at Nippur. The University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur recovered over 30,000 tablets, spanning from early dynastic through Parthian periods, nearly 3 millennia of continuous habitation and literary production. The site's longevity and the content of its archives, heavily weighted toward religious and literary texts rather than purely administrative documents, suggest Nippur functioned as knowledge repository, training center for scribes, library where canonical texts were maintained. If civilization was transmitted knowledge, Nippur was the main server. When kingship transferred from city to city, it wasn't merely political conquest. The king list describes transfers as events. Kish was defeated. Its kingship was carried to Uruk. In Uruk, Mesh-Kiang-Gasha, son of the sun god, became king. The kingship moves, as if a discrete transferable entity. The new king is often described as son or chosen of a particular deity, suggesting divine selection mechanism rather than human power struggle alone. This pattern holds through historically verifiable periods. Sargon of Akkad, 2334-2279 BNX, founder of the first empire uniting Sumer and Akkad, claimed divine election despite humble origins. My mother was a high priestess. My father I did not know. My mother, the high priestess, conceived me. In secret she bore me. She placed me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, adopted me as his son and reared me. Aki appointed me as his gardener. Yet despite this low start, Sargon becomes king, conquers vast territories, and rules 56 yearsly verified. How? The texts say Inanna loved him, granted him authority. Again, divine selection overriding human social barriers. Sargon's consolidation of Mesopotamia into a single empire represents historical watershed. Before him, city-states competed. After him, empire becomes the model, centralized authority, standardized administration, unified cultic. This matches the original template. The antediluvian world apparently had unified structure under Anunnaki governance, which fragmented post-flood into competing cities, then was reunified under Sargon's Akkadian Empire, in echo of the original pattern. But empires collapsed. The Akkadian Empire fell around 2154 BCE to invasion and internal revolt. The Earthri Empire, 2112-2004 BCE, which reunified Sumer after the Akkadian collapse, itself collapsed under pressure from Amorite invasions and Elamite. Each collapse follows a pattern the texts document. Divine abandonment precedes material failure. The lament for composed after that city's fall, describes the gods departing. The lady of the city, Ningal, wept bitter tears. Alas, the destroyed city, my destroyed temple. Outside the city, before the city, the mistress's bitter tears flowed. When they ordered its bitter temple to be destroyed, An did not change that word. When they ordered that the temple must be destroyed, Enlil did not change that word. The warriors who are to destroy our city have been commanded by Enlil. An did not oppose this with a different command. Enlil did not bring us rescue. The gods deliberated, decided, withdrew. Then destruction followed. The pattern mirrors the flood. Divine council makes decision. Even protective deities cannot prevent it. Implementation proceeds. Remnant survives. But unlike the flood, post-urban collapses are partial. He falls, the population scatters, the temples are destroyed, but neighbouring cities survive. Kingship transfers elsewhere. Civilization continues, but this city's particular expression of it ends. Why would the Anunnaki abandon cities they'd established? The texts suggest political realignment among the gods themselves, territorial disputes, shifting alliances, revised priorities. If the Anunnaki were political entities with their own conflicts, their human cities would reflect those conflicts. When Inanna's power increased, Uruk flourished. When Enlil reasserted authority, Nippur-aligned cities gained advantage. When Enki's influence waxed, Eridu traditions spread. This creates a troubling implication. Human civilizations as proxy territories in larger conflicts. Cities rise and fall based on factors beyond human control, reflecting power dynamics among the beings who establish those cities. Humans work, build, pray, and die in service to whichever Anunnaki holds current authority. When that authority shifts, the city collapses, regardless of human virtue or failure. This is neither just nor comforting. It's bureaucratic, it's geopolitical, it's organizational restructuring, where the reorganized entities are human society. And it suggests that the fall of civilization's narrative, usually framed as human failure, moral decay, or environmental mismanagement, might sometimes be external decisions by entities whose concerns operate at different scales than human welfare. The question becomes, if kingship descended from heaven, if it could be granted and withdrawn, if divine abandonment preceded collapse, then what happened when the Anunnaki eventually withdrew entirely? And the text suggests they did, gradually across the centuries, until finally the temple stood empty, the me were lost, and humanity was left with institutional structures they could maintain mechanically, but no longer understood organically. A cargo cult running the original system without the original operator. The problem mainstream cannot answer. Academic consensus on the Sumerian text clear. These are mythological narratives serving religious, political, and social functions within their culture. The Anunnaki are gods in a polytheistic system. The creation accounts are mythological explanations for natural phenomena. The flood narratives are legendary accounts of historical flooding events, elaborated through oral transmission into cosmic drama. The king list's impossible chronology is symbolic or corrupted. The me are abstract concepts personified. The Obkalu are mythological culture heroes. None of it describes literal historical events involving non-human intelligences. This interpretation is coherent, respects methodological naturalism, avoids sensationalism, and aligns with standard approaches to mythology worldwide. It's the professional, responsible position. Scholars who advocate for it aren't close-minded or conspiratorial. They're applying appropriate skepticism to extraordinary claims.
Yet this interpretation faces specific problems when confronting certain textual details. These aren't vague inconsistencies or subjective judgments. They're concrete passages where mainstream symbolic/mythological reading struggles to account for what the text actually says. Problem 1. Administrative language for divine actions. The Sumerian king list doesn't read like myth. Compare it to other ancient king lists that blend history and mythology. The Egyptian king list includes divine dynasties of gods reigning before human kings, but those sections use different linguistic register, more poetic, more explicitly supernatural. When the list transitions to human pharaohs, the language shifts to historical tone. The Sumerian king list maintains consistent administrative tone throughout. The antediluvian section uses the same grammatical structures, same formulaic repetitions, same documentary style as the historical sections. If this were intentional mythologizing, we'd expect markers signalling this section is different, but the text treats all reigns, impossible and historical, identically. Either the whole document is unreliable, including verified historical sections, or the impossible sections represent something other than pure fiction. Scholars respond, the reign lengths are symbolic or corrupted through transmission errors, the consistent tone reflects literary convention. But this doesn't explain why such massive numbers, 28,800 years, weren't recognised as implausible by the scribes who repeatedly copied the text for over 1,000 years. These were sophisticated mathematicians and astronomers. They could calculate complex astronomical cycles. They weren't innumerate. If they preserved these numbers generation after generation, they apparently had reason to consider them significant rather than obviously false. Problem 2. Procedural specificity in technical passages. When Utnapishtim describes building the boat in Gilgamesh Tablet C, the level of technical detail is extraordinary. Equal shall be her width and her length. Like the Apsu, thou shalt roof her over. Precise geometric specifications. Cube-shaped vessel. Then I gave it 7 decks. Its interior I divided into 9 sections. Water plugs I fastened within it. I saw to the punting poles and laid in what was needful. I poured pitch into the furnace. 3 shar of bitumen I poured into the kiln. 3 shar of pitch I poured into it. Specific waterproofing procedures. Exact quantities. This reads like engineering documentation. Mythology doesn't typically require such specificity. Noah's Ark in Genesis is described vaguely. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Dimensions given, but no construction process. The Gilgamesh account describes how to build it. Materials, methods, sequences. Why include this if the narrative is purely symbolic? Mainstream answer: verisimilitude, literary realism to make the story more vivid. But other mythological narratives don't employ this technique. When Greek heroes build ships, when Norse gods construct halls, when Indian sages create flying vehicles, the descriptions are impressionistic, not procedural. The Mesopotamian flood accounts are uniquely technical, suggesting the text aims to preserve buildable design. Problem 3. Contradiction between moral interpretation and textual content. Biblical flood narrative clearly establishes moral framework. Humans are wicked, God judges them, righteous Noah is saved. Mesopotamian flood accounts lack this framework. Humanity isn't described as wicked. The decision to flood is not judgment, but noise management. Enlil is annoyed, not righteous. Scholars explain this as demonstrating Mesopotamian pessimism about divine nature. The gods are capricious. Humans are victims of cosmic indifference. This is theologically interesting, but culturally problematic. If Mesopotamians believed their gods were unjust, why did they worship them so devotedly? Why build massive temples, provide endless offerings, maintain costly priesthoods for beings who might destroy you on a whim for no moral reason? Alternative explanation, the texts don't present the Anunnaki as morally perfect gods deserving worship, because that's not what they were. They were powerful, knowledgeable beings deserving respect and practical accommodation, but not morally exemplary entities deserving reverence. The relationship was transactional. Humans provide labour and offerings. Anunnaki provide knowledge and organisation. When Anunnaki withdrew, system collapsed, not because moral order was violated, but because technical support ended. Problem 4. Knowledge permanence and transmission claims. Berossus's account of Oannes concludes, from that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions. This is an extraordinary claim. It asserts that civilization, as it existed in the 3rd century BC, was essentially what Oannes taught thousands of years earlier, nothing fundamentally improved since. If this were obviously false propaganda, why make such a claim? If Babylonian civilization had clearly advanced beyond ancient foundations, contemporaries would recognize the statement as absurd. But if the claim had cultural currency, if it resonated with lived experience of consulting ancient texts that couldn't be improved upon, then it makes sense. Late Babylonian astronomical texts frequently reference ancient sources they're copying and commenting upon, but not surpassing. Medical texts cite ancient authorities. Legal codes claim to restore ancient justice. The cultural memory is of knowledge descending from remote past, maintained through transmission, degrading over time without new input from original source. Progressive model predicts opposite. Each generation should know more than previous. But Mesopotamian texts consistently assert the reverse. Ancients knew more. We preserve fragments. We've lost much. This pattern fits installation/degradation model, contradicts invention/improvement model. Problem 5. Global flood traditions with specific correspondences. Over 250 cultures worldwide have flood traditions. Standard explanation: floods are common natural disasters. Each culture independently mythologized local floods, but the specific correspondences between Mesopotamian and other traditions suggest possible shared source, divine warning to specific individual, instruction to build boat with precise specifications, preservation of humans and animals, birds sent out to test for dry land, post-flood, sacrifice, divine oath/rainbow/covenant promising no future flood. These elements appear in Genesis, Matsialim, Deucalion, Ziusudra-Laden, Atrahasis, Adan, and others. The probability of independent invention of this exact sequence across cultures separated by thousands of miles is low. Standard explanation: diffusion from single source, probably Mesopotamia, as cultures encountered each other through trade. But diffusion model requires explained mechanism of transmission. How did detailed Mesopotamian flood account reach Indian subcontinent, Aegean Greece, and beyond? Trade? Why would traders memorize and transmit complex mythological narratives? Conquest? No evidence of Mesopotamian conquest reaching those regions in the relevant periods. Alternative, the flood traditions preserve common memory of actual global or near global catastrophic flooding event experienced by geographically distributed populations, each of which preserved local versions. The correspondences reflect shared experience, not cultural borrowing. The Mesopotamian versions are most detailed because Mesopotamia developed writing earliest, fixing the oral traditions in permanent form. Problem 6. Absence of clear developmental trajectory. Standard model of cultural evolution predicts gradual development, simple tools before complex, basic knowledge before advanced, trial and error before systematization. Mesopotamian archaeology shows sudden appearance of complex systems. Writing appears around 3200 BCE already functional, used for sophisticated accounting. Urban planning appears suddenly with Uruk, large-scale construction, standardized measurements, centralized administration. Mathematical texts show advanced competence immediately, no surviving elementary stages. Astronomical knowledge emerges already sophisticated, tracking complex cycles. Legal systems appear fully developed in earliest examples. Where are the preceding stages? Where's the learning curve? Standard answer: they existed but haven't been excavated yet, or they were imperishable materials that didn't survive. But after 150 years of intensive archaeology across Mesopotamia, the absence of developmental stages is conspicuous. Texts attribute sudden appearance to divine instruction. Mainstream dismisses this as mythology, but dismissal doesn't explain the archaeological pattern. If civilization emerged gradually through human innovation, where's the evidence of that gradual emergence? Problem 7. Technological decline and knowledge loss. Later Mesopotamian texts frequently lament inability to match ancient standards, construction techniques. Later builders couldn't replicate earlier massive stone foundations. Mathematical precision. Later astronomical texts contain calculation errors absent in earlier versions. Medical knowledge. Later medical texts are shorter, less comprehensive than earlier ones. Linguistic competence. Later scribes copying Sumerian texts often didn't fully understand them. Standard explanation. Political instability. Economic decline. Reduced literacy. Warfare disrupting transmission. But these explain temporary losses, not permanent degradation. Given sufficient time and stability, shouldn't knowledge be recovered and improved? Unless the knowledge was never indigenous to begin with. If it was transmitted from external source, then when that source withdrew, the knowledge couldn't be recovered, because no human population ever developed it independently. People could maintain what was given while the connection lasted, but couldn't regenerate it once lost. Problem 8. The vanishing. Multiple texts describe the gods withdrawing, becoming less present, less accessible. City laments describe gods abandoning their temples. Later prayers complain gods don't respond as they used to. By the Persian and Hellenistic periods, the sense is pervasive, the gods have left, the temples are maintained by tradition, but the real presence is gone. If the gods were always purely symbolic, why would their absence be noted as historical change? Symbols don't become absent, they're either recognized or not. But actual beings can be present, then absent. If the Anunnaki were real entities who gradually withdrew over centuries, the textual pattern makes sense. Early periods have frequent interaction, middle periods have mediated contact through temples and priests, late periods have only ritual forms maintained without expectation of actual response. Archaeological evidence supports this. Earlier temples show evidence of regular activity, offerings, maintenance. Later temples are maintained, but with less intensive use, eventually falling into disrepair. Not because people stopped believing suddenly, but because the system they believed in stopped functioning, gradually, irreversibly. The academic response. Mainstream scholarship responds to these problems with methodological naturalism. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Testimony isn't sufficient, no matter how ancient cultural context. We must understand these texts within their cultural framework. Not impose modern categories. 3 symbolic reading. Myths encode deep truths metaphorically, not literally. 4 agnosticism about what we can't explain. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Missing stages may yet be found. These responses are methodologically sound. They prevent scholarship from descending into pseudo-archaeology, ancient astronaut sensationalism, or credulous acceptance of texts without critical analysis. They represent appropriate skepticism, but appropriate skepticism should cut both ways. Just as we shouldn't credulously accept texts as literal truth, we shouldn't reflexively dismiss them as pure fiction when they claim to document specific events. The texts themselves demand we take them seriously, not necessarily literally, but seriously. They're written by sophisticated cultures, preserved meticulously across millennia, translated and studied by brilliant scholars. They deserve the respect of considering, what if these preserve some thread of accurate memory, not memory of gods in the supernatural sense, not ancient astronauts in the sensationalized sense, but memory of contact with non-human intelligences, biological, advanced, purposeful, who intervened at specific junctures to establish and maintain early civilization, then withdrew, leaving humanity to continue or fail based on how well we'd internalized what was taught. That possibility, not certainty, but possibility, deserves examination. And when it's examined, patterns emerge that align troublingly well with what the texts describe. Not perfect alignment, not proof, but sufficient correspondence to warrant continued investigation rather than dismissive closure. Because if the texts preserve even fragmentary truth about external influence on civilization's origins, then every collapse, including our own if it comes, might follow the same pattern. The knowledge source withdraws, the system degrades, the civilization falls. And the question becomes, are we living in a late-stage degradation phase, maintaining systems we no longer fully understand, waiting for collapse? Or is there a way to recover the knowledge, to reopen contact, to restore what was lost? The texts don't answer that. They only document what happened before. But the patterns they describe repeated across Mesopotamian history, cycle after cycle, and that repetition is documented. When civilization fractured, around 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire, first multi-regional state in Mesopotamia, unifying Sumer and Akkad under Sargon and his successors, collapsed. The capital, Agade, was abandoned. Its exact location is still unknown, possibly because it was so thoroughly destroyed that no significant ruins remained. Within decades, Mesopotamia fragmented into competing city-states, infrastructure deteriorated, trade networks collapsed, and population declined. The curse of a god, composed after this collapse, attributes the disaster to divine judgment. For the first time since cities were built, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain, the inundated tracts produced no fish, the irrigated orchards produced neither honey nor wine, the gathered. Clouds did not rain. For the first time since cities were built, the vegetation of the wide plain did not grow tall, the vegetation became sickly. The gods fled from Agoid like a swarm of locuons. The pattern, divine abandonment, then material collapse. The text specifies what triggered the abandonment. Naram Sin, grandson of Sargon, violated the eco-temple of Enlil at Nippur. Whether literal vandalism or political subordination of Nippur's priesthood, the action broke the covenant between kingship and divine authority. Enlil withdrew support. Other gods followed. The empire fell within a generation. Archaeological evidence confirms sudden collapse. Tel Leilan in northern Syria, part of the Akkadian Empire's extended network, shows abrupt abandonment around 2200 BC. Soil samples indicate severe drought lasting decades. Moriang's Cortes analysis of archaeological layers found evidence of massive dust storms, soil deflation, and climate aridification. Harvey Weiss's excavations documented citywide abandonment with no signs of gradual decline. People left rapidly, taking valuables, leaving infrastructure intact but unused. But climate change alone doesn't explain regional specificity. Southern Mesopotamia remained inhabited. Uruk or Lagash continued as population centres. If drought affected the entire region, why did only the Akkadian core collapse completely while Sumerian cities survived? The texts suggest because divine protection withdrew from Agade specifically, not from Mesopotamia generally. This pattern repeats. Around 2000 BC, the Ur-3 Empire, the Neo-Sumerian revival that reunified Mesopotamia after the Akkadian collapse, itself collapsed under Elamite invasion and Amorite pressure. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur describes the disaster Enlil called the storm. The people mourn. Winds of abundance he took from the land. The people mourn. He brought the storm. The people mourn. The storm that annihilates the land he brought. The people mourn. Again, divine decision precedes material catastrophe. Enlil decides. The storm comes. Not metaphorical storm, but what appears to be actual military invasion framed in religious language. The kingship of the land was seized by the Elamites, who had attacked like a swarm of locusts. Ur itself was besieged, its walls breached, its temples burnt, its population massacred or enslaved. Why did divine protection fail? The texts provide answers, but they're politically and theologically complex. One tradition claims King Ibisin, last ruler of Ur III, failed to properly maintain the temples. Another suggests Enlil had simply decided to end the Ur III period and transfer kingship elsewhere. A third, most troubling possibility, the gods themselves were divided, some supporting Ur, others supporting its enemies, and the anti-Ur faction prevailed. This introduces a pattern seen repeatedly in Mesopotamian history. Divine politics drives human politics. Cities align with specific deities. When those deities' power waxes in the divine council, their human cities prosper. When divine fortunes shift, human consequences follow. The Anunnaki are not united. They compete, form factions, make alliances, betray those alliances. Human civilization reflects their conflicts. The Late Bronze Age collapse 1200–1150 represents the most catastrophic example. Not just Mesopotamia, but the entire eastern Mediterranean region experienced simultaneous civilizational breakdown. Hittite Empire in Anatolia, capital Hattusa burnt, abandoned, never reoccupied. Mycenaean Greece, palaces destroyed, writing lost, dark ages follow. Egyptian New Kingdom, weakened, severely, lost territories entered decline. Ugarit on Syrian coast, destroyed completely, never rebuilt. Cyprus, major settlements abandoned. Mesopotamia, Assyrian Empire contracts. Babylonia enters chaos. The archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction layers dated to 1200–1150. Beck. Site abandonment across multiple regions. Population decline estimates 60–90% in some areas. Loss of literacy, Linear B writing in Greece disappears for 400 years. Trade network collapse, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Aegean exchange ceases. Technological regression, Iron Age, begins partly. Because bronze supply chains failed, explanations proposed. Climate change, drought, crop failure, famine, supported by pollen analysis and climate proxies showing aridification. Earthquake storms, sequence of major earthquakes destabilizing architecture, supported by destruction layer. Analysis. Sea people's invasion, mysterious maritime raiders, mentioned in Egyptian texts, but identity and origin unclear. Systems collapse, interconnected trade networks failed cascadingly when one component broke. Internal revolt, oppressed populations rebelled against palace elites, supported by destruction patterns targeting administrative centres. All these factors likely contributed, but the simultaneity across such vast region suggests larger context, and the Mesopotamian texts provide one: divine withdrawal on unprecedented scale. The Song of the Scarecrow, a Sumerian text from the post-collapse period, contains the remarkable line, "The Anu have abandoned us like sheep without a shepherd. The Anunnaki are gone, humanity is alone, and without them the systems they established fail." Cyrus Gordon, one of the few scholars to take ancient testimony seriously as potential historical evidence, noted the collapse was too widespread, too synchronized, to be explained by local factors alone. Something happened that affected the entire civilizational network simultaneously. The texts say the gods withdrew. We should at least consider that this might describe something real, not supernatural entities, but whatever the ancients conceptualized as gods withdrawing their presence. If the Anunnaki were real entities maintaining civilization through knowledge transfer, administrative organization, and periodic intervention, their withdrawal would logically precipitate collapse. Not immediately. Systems can coast on momentum for decades, but eventually, without maintenance, without course correction, without the knowledge base that kept the system functioning, entropy wins. The Bronze Age kingdoms had become dependent on complex systems. Bronze required tin from copper mixed in precise ratios, distributed through extensive trade networks. Writing required trained scribes, expensive materials, institutional continuity. Large-scale irrigation required maintenance, coordination, technical knowledge. Monumental architecture required mathematical sophistication, engineering understanding, resource mobilization. When the entities who'd installed these systems withdrew, who understood how to maintain them? The texts suggest the priesthoods trained in temple schools, passing down knowledge generationally. But priesthoods were tied to temples, temples were tied to palace economies depended on trade networks. When one component failed, cascading collapse followed. Knowledge holders died, archives burned, training ceased, competence disappeared. The Iron Age that followed was technologically simpler, but institutionally more fragmented. Bronze Age kingdoms were centralized, literate, bureaucratic. Iron Age societies were decentralized, less literate, more tribal. The progression runs backward, from complex to simple, from organized to chaotic, from knowledge to ignorance. Standard historiography struggles with this. Progress is supposed to be generally upward, with occasional setbacks followed by recovery. But the Bronze Age collapse represented civilizational regression on massive scale, followed by centuries during which earlier capabilities couldn't be recovered. Greece didn't regain Bronze Age literacy levels until 800 BC, 400 years later. The Hittite Empire vanished so completely that its existence was doubted until late 19th century archaeological discoveries. What the texts describe is this: the Anunnaki, whose presence had stabilized and organized Bronze Age civilization, withdrew. Why? The texts don't specify clearly. Perhaps conditions changed, making Earth less habitable for them. Perhaps their mission was complete. Perhaps political decisions were made at some higher level beyond the local Anunnaki. Regardless of reason, the texts document a transition from presence to absence, and wherever presence became absence, civilization degraded. Temples were maintained as long as economic surplus allowed, but without expectation of actual divine contact. Rituals were performed, but became empty forms. Priests copied ancient texts without fully understanding them. Kings claimed divine authority, but knew they didn't receive actual divine counsel. The system ran on autopilot until it couldn't anymore. This pattern, installation, fluorescence, degradation, collapse, repeats across Mesopotamian history, Sumerian early dynastic period, fluorescence, then collapse into Akkadian conquest, Akkadian Empire, consolidation, then collapse, Neo-Sumerian Ur, restoration, then collapse, Old Babylonian, period, revival, then collapse under Hittite raid, Kassite period, long stability, then gradual decline, Neo-Assyrian Empire, massive expansion, then sudden collapse, Neo-Babylonian Empire, brief fluorescence, then Persian conquest. Each cycle follows similar arc. Divine favour grants success. Human, hubris or divine politics withdraws favour. Collapse follows. The pattern suggests civilization in Mesopotamia was never self-sustaining. It required external input to function. When input was present, civilization flourished. When input withdrew, civilization collapsed. The cycles weren't random, but reflected changing relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki. By the Persian and Hellenistic periods, the sense is complete. The gods are gone. The old knowledge is lost. We maintain traditions we no longer understand. Babylonian astronomers still made observations, but their theoretical framework was crumbling. Temples still functioned, but more as cultural museums than active religious centres. The system had become cargo cult, performing inherited forms without operational understanding. And then even the cargo cult ended. Mesopotamian civilization was absorbed into Hellenistic, then Roman, then Islamic cultures. The temples were abandoned, the cuneiform script was forgotten, the tablets were buried in ruins. By 400 C, no one could read Sumerian or Akkadian. The last cuneiform tablet was written in 75 C. 5,000 years of continuous tradition ended. What the Mesopotamian texts document is a civilization that understood itself as established and maintained by external entities, whose long history was series of cycles reflecting the presence or absence of those entities, whose final end came when those entities permanently withdrew and the knowledge they'd provided was finally exhausted. If this account preserves truth, then three interpretations remain possible, each with different implications. The question of intervention. Three frameworks exist for interpreting the mass of evidence presented. Each has internal coherence, each explains some data better than others, none explains everything perfectly. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. The texts are mythological narratives serving social, political, and religious functions. The Anunnaki are gods in a polytheistic system, personifications of natural forces, cosmic principles, or social structures. The creation accounts explain origins metaphorically. The flood narratives preserve memory of historical flooding events, elaborated into cosmic drama. The impossible chronologies are symbolic, representing cosmages, or corrupted through transmission errors. The sudden appearance of civilization reflects rapid but natural development. The Apkallu are culture heroes, the Me are abstract concepts, the temples are symbolic structures. Archaeological patterns of sudden sophistication are explained by invisible developmental stages that haven't been excavated, 2. Rapid indigenous innovation under favourable conditions, 3. Cultural diffusion from yet undiscovered source populations. Knowledge degradation is explained by political instability, economic decline, warfare disrupting transmission. The consistency across texts reflects literary convention, cultural expectations, and mythological pattern making. Strengths of this interpretation: requires no extraordinary entities or mechanisms, aligns with standard approaches to mythology worldwide, respects methodological naturalism, has overwhelming scholarly consensus, problems it struggles to explain, administrative tone in text describing divine actions, procedural specificity in technical passages, sudden appearance of sophisticated systems without clear precursors, knowledge permanence claims and cultural memory of ancient superiority, pattern of divine withdrawal preceding material collapse across multiple independent events. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom. The texts are sophisticated philosophical and spiritual teachings encoded in narrative form. The Anunnaki represent aspects of higher consciousness or cosmic principles. The creation accounts describe spiritual generation of the cosmos or evolution of consciousness. The flood represents catastrophic transformation of consciousness or death and rebirth initiatory process. The Apkallu are enlightened teachers, possibly historical sages whose stories were elaborated. The Me represent initiatory knowledge or spiritual principles for organizing society harmoniously. The temples are sacred spaces for consciousness transformation. The impossible chronologies represent spiritual time, not chronological time. The agricultural and civilizational arts, taught by the gods, represent transmission of sacred knowledge through initiated lineages. Kingship descending from heaven means legitimate authority must align with cosmic order or higher consciousness. Divine withdrawal represents loss of spiritual alignment or degradation of initiatory transmission. Civilizational collapse follows loss of sacred knowledge. Strengths of this interpretation respects the texts as repositories of profound wisdom, explains why knowledge was considered sacred and carefully preserved, accounts for initiatory and esoteric dimensions present in texts, explains transmission through priesthoods and temple schools. Problems: it struggles to explain. Why encode teachings in elaborate historical seeming narratives rather than straightforward wisdom literature which exists separately in same culture? Why maintain precise impossible numbers if they're symbolic? Why describe specific architectural specifications, medical procedures, and astronomical calculations if purpose is spiritual teaching? Why the texts don't behave like other known wisdom literature from same period? Interpretation 3. Documentary core. The texts preserve fragmentary but authentic memory of contact with non-human biological intelligences, the Anunnaki, who intervened during critical periods of human development to establish civilization. These beings were not supernatural gods, but advanced entities, possibly from elsewhere in the solar system or beyond, with superior knowledge in agriculture, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and social organization. They arrived during the late Paleolithic or early Neolithic period, encountered developing human populations, and initiated a program of civilizational uplift, possibly for their own purposes, Simbraforce, resource extraction, experimental interest, or as part of larger mission we can't reconstruct. They established initial settlements in southern Mesopotamia, created or modified humans for enhanced cognitive capacity, the creation counts, and systematically transmitted knowledge packages necessary for complex civilization. The Apkallu represent a specific mechanism, long-lived teachers or periodically returning instructors who maintained knowledge transmission across generations. The antediluvian period represents the initial installation phase lasting thousands of years. The flood was either natural catastrophe of Ice Age sea level rise or deliberately triggered population control measure when human numbers exceeded acceptable parameters. Post-flood restoration was accomplished through the preserved knowledge line, Zat-Utrui, with civilization rebuilt following original templates but under modified constraints. The Anunnaki maintained presence through the Bronze Age, though increasingly mediated through temple institutions and priesthoods rather than direct contact. Political conflicts among Anunnaki factions played out through human proxy civilizations, explaining why divine politics drives human politics in the texts. Gradual withdrawal began during the Late Bronze Age, culminating in the 1200 BC collapse when support systems failed on unprecedented scale. Final withdrawal occurred during the Iron Age, leaving humanity with inherited systems we maintain mechanically but understood decreasingly well. By the classical period, the Anunnaki were gone, and what remained was cultural memory encoded in religious traditions that gradually became purely mythological as living memory faded. Strengths of this interpretation: explains administrative tone and procedural specificity. These are attempts at documentation. Accounts for sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization. It was installed, not invented. Explains knowledge degradation without ongoing technical support, inherited. Systems decay. Makes sense of divine withdrawal pattern. Actual entities can be present then absent. Aligns with the text's own self-understanding as preserving historical memory. Problems it creates: requires accepting existence of advanced non-human intelligences visiting Earth in prehistory. Lacks direct physical evidence. Artifacts unambiguously identified as Anunnaki technology, invites association with discredited pseudo-archaeology and ancient astronaut sensationalism, challenges fundamental assumptions about human history and development. None of these interpretations can be proven conclusively with available evidence. The first is safest academically, the second is richest spiritually, the third is most troubling existentially, because if it contains truth, then humanity has been alone far longer than we've been guided, and the systems we inherited are degrading beyond our capacity to restore them. The texts themselves don't demand we choose. They simply preserve what was witnessed, remembered, and recorded by sophisticated civilizations across millennia. They describe a world where the boundary between human and non-human intelligence was permeable, where civilization was gift rather than achievement, where knowledge descended rather than ascended, and where collapse followed not human failure but external withdrawal. Whether that world ever existed objectively, or existed only in Mesopotamian conceptual frameworks, or exists now in some form we no longer recognize, the texts cannot answer. They can only testify to what the Sumerians believed they experienced. And what they believed shaped everything that followed: writing, cities, law, mathematics, astronomy, literature itself. If they were documenting metaphor, they created the most elaborate and persistent metaphor in human history. If they were encoding wisdom, they encoded it so deeply we still haven't fully extracted it. If they were documenting contact, then we are the inheritors of a gift whose givers have departed, maintaining systems we barely comprehend, waiting in a silence that may be permanent, where memory touches mystery. The Weld Blundell prism remains in its Oxford vault unchanged. The clay is 3,800 years old. The script has been read countless times. The rain lengths still say 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Then the flood. Then kingship descended from heaven again. Whether those numbers preserve truth or encode something beyond truth, they've outlasted the civilization that inscribed them. They've outlasted the language they're written in. They've outlasted every interpretation offered for them. They simply persist, waiting. What we know is this: the Sumerians wrote in administrative language about beings from the sky who organized their world. They preserved those writings with obsessive care across thousands of years. They built massive structures aligned to mathematical and celestial precision. They possessed sudden sophisticated knowledge with no visible learning curve. They described their civilization as gift, not achievement. And they documented a pattern: presence, absence, collapse. What we don't know is whether that pattern describes external reality, internal experience, or something that dissolves the boundary between those categories entirely. If you've listened this far, you've heard the evidence. You've encountered the tensions, the problems, the possibilities. The choice of interpretation is yours. The texts don't force conclusions. They offer testimony, preserve memory, and allow questions to remain unanswered. Perhaps that's their deepest wisdom, not in what they claim to answer, but in how they hold open space for mystery. In a world that demands certainty, that insists we choose between scientific materialism or religious literalism, the Sumerian tablets offer third way: documentation of the inexplicable, preservation of the impossible, testimony to what cannot be proven but will not be forgotten. The Anunnaki, whether gods, teachers, metaphors, or memories, shaped how humanity thinks about itself. They introduced the idea that civilization is something given, something that can be lost, something that requires maintenance from sources beyond ourselves. Whether that idea is true or only useful, it has persisted because it explains something we recognize: the fragility of what we've built, the sense of standing on foundations we didn't lay, the suspicion that we've forgotten something crucial. The tablets wait in climate-controlled museums. The sites lie beneath Iraqi sands. The words have been translated, debated, dismissed, and defended. But the question remains, quiet and patient as clay. Did we rise alone, or were we lifted? And if we were lifted, what happens when the hands release? The answer, if it exists, is not in any single tablet, but in the pattern they preserve across 5,000 years, the rise and fall of civilizations, the presence and absence of gods, the gift and loss of knowledge, the cycle that may still be turning. Wherever you are, whatever hour you're drifting through, that question is now yours to carry. Sleep well with the mystery.